This is Audible.
Dead Frost. Written by Adam Millard. Narrated by Luke Smith. Prologue. The world ended on October the 7th, 2011. Not with a bang, as some theorists predicted, but with a whimper. There was no fruition of a Mayan prophecy, no alien attack, no terrorist uprising, and no supervolcano eruption. It was a simple virus that finished mankind off, a superflu that couldn't be cured once it had been contracted. It started in America, in a place called Burlington, Oklahoma. From there it spread north, taking out the surrounding states within 36 hours of the first reported incident. Within 3 days, the entire United States of America was under attack, the infected people like years. 1. The streets below were filled with lurkers. They were so tightly packed between the dilapidated stores that there was hardly room for them to maneuver, and they bounced off each other the way cells did beneath a microscope. That was what they were, a strand of vehement flu with only one purpose: search and infect. When the outbreak first happened, Shane Bridge was incarcerated, awaiting his release date with excitement and hope. Now, with his legs dangling out the side of the helicopter and an M1919 Browning machine gun between his legs, there was very little left to hope for. "No target practice tonight?" a voice said through Shane's headset. It startled him a little, and his trigger finger tensed, firing off a single round that was meant for nobody in particular. The pilot, Kyle Polson, or Flyboy as he was affectionately known, banked that it was the reason they had been dispatched. A few people were starting to get sick with chest infections and flu. The antibiotics would have seen them through the winter, providing they snared a decent haul of them. Of course, you could never predict the state of the streets, and setting the helicopter down next to the pharmacy would have been suicide. It would have to wait. "I do believe," Flyboy chuckled into his microphone, "that this is the 7th day in a row that you've volunteered for scavenger duty." He laughed before adding, "Any particular reason why you won't let one of the young grunts have a go?" Shane didn't want to tell Flyboy his reasons for leaving the barracks, so he made something up, and it came out so naturally that he almost believed it himself. "I've just got out of prison," Shane said. "I guess you could say that I'm trying to repay my debt to society." It was bullshit, but it didn't stink. "Ah," the voice crackled. "And you think that being the hero and bringing these good people what they need to survive is somehow making up for the fact that you fucked it up in the first place? I can see where you're coming from, although I'm not quite sure I'd be doing the same thing if I were in your shoes." The lie was about to thicken, and Shane couldn't believe it when words started falling out of his mouth. "I promised myself while I was inside," he went on, "that I'd make up for what I did. This is my way. This is the punishment that I deserve." Shane sighed, covering the tiny microphone dangling in front of his mouth so that the pilot didn't hear. "Well, all I can say to that is bravo," Flyboy said, and the sound of hands clapping together came through to Shane's earphones. The helicopter did a little shift to the right, which made Shane grab onto the leather handle next to him. Flyboy was a good pilot, possibly the best pilot they could have been left with, but Shane wasn't sure how stable he was when it came to flying with no hands on the controls. "Just keep this bitch under control," Shane said. "Otherwise, neither of us will return heroes." As the chopper drifted homeward, Shane thought about the real reason why he had optioned for scavenger duty every night for the last 7. He was restless. And he believed in his heart of hearts that his wife and daughter were still out there, somewhere. Whether they were alive was another matter, but he could feel them beating inside of him, their souls still connected to him in some sense. The nightmares that he had suffered, the endless visions he had been plagued with for almost a month, were taking their toll. He knew he had to do something. It was the not knowing that was killing him. The helicopter sliced through the cold midnight air towards the barracks, where sick people were waiting for medicine and would be severely disappointed when the scavengers returned empty-handed. 2. Marla heard the helicopter approaching and rushed out into the freezing night. There was already a small gathering of people awaiting the scavengers' return. They were clinging to each other for warmth, and despite the fact that they were wearing coats that were several sizes too big for them, and blankets which they had stripped from their makeshift beds, they shivered and clenched their teeth together uncomfortably. "How long have they been gone?" Marla asked the crowd. One of them would know down to the exact second. "Only 2 hours," Victor Lord replied. What was obviously a bald patch, it was because he was a cunt. The kind of man you couldn't trust as far as you could throw him. Shane didn't like him either. He had never said it, not in as many words, but Marla could tell just by the look in his eyes whenever Lord was talking, or barking orders, as was usually the case, that Shane was just as wary as she. "Right. All of you," Victor said, chomping his rudimentary cigar as if his life depended on it. "I want you to go back inside. The last thing we fucking need is more of you getting sick. Shit. This flu's going around quicker than a Vietnamese ladyboy." The crowd glanced at each other, as if to test the captain's resolve, but eventually dispersed, shuffling slowly towards the doors that led back into the barracks. Marla didn't know why Victor had to be so mean all of the time. They were in it together, and it was nobody's fault, at least none of the people who he had just ordered back inside. "You're not going to make many friends talking to people like that," Marla said, trying to stand her ground. Victor seemed to grow an inch as he turned to face her. His eyebrows knitted together, and when he took the cigar out of the corner of his mouth, Marla wished she'd kept her own mouth shut. "Listen, lady," he spat. "I ain't here to make fucking friends. I'm here to make survivors. If they don't like the way I talk to them, then they can ride on out of here and find a nice thing out just a few inches below them. So why don't you run along with your friends?" He made quote marks with his fingers to reiterate his intentions towards the rest of the group, "and I'll keep us all alive. Feel free to thank me later." Now he had pissed her off royally. It was no use arguing with him, though. He was ex-military, as stubborn as they came, and he liked to think that the world owed him something. It didn't. The helicopter appeared just at that moment, which was lucky, as Marla was about as frustrated as she possibly could have been. As Victor stepped away from the helipad and edged closer to the roof's end, Marla had the urge to accidentally nudge him over. She was pretty sure that nobody would miss him. Fuck. The rest of the group might worship her like a goddess. As the helicopter touched down, kicking up a miasma of dirt that whirled and danced in the night air, Victor turned and made little walking legs with his fingers. This only served to infuriate Marla even more, but she knew she'd be the first to hear from Shane if there was a problem. She turned, shivered as a mixture of gale force wind and rotor spin caught her full on at the nape of her neck, and headed indoors. Victor Lord sneered. "Fucking nuisance," he muttered, although it was barely audible as the sound of the helicopter powering down filled the night. Shane lowered himself from the side of the craft and zipped up his parka. He began to unload rucksacks, most of which remained empty, and ammunition. Flyboy dropped down from the pilot's door and offered the captain the cheesiest grin he could muster. "Bit fucking cold, ain't it?" Flyboy said, glancing towards the stars as if he was a seasoned astronomer. "Never mind the fucking weather," Victor said, closing the gap between the edge of the roof and the now dormant helicopter. "Please tell me you got the fucking antibiotics. Fucking day." Shane hoisted the backpacks up onto his shoulders and lifted an ammunition box to balance himself. "There are hundreds of them out there," he said. "Maybe thousands. The city is off limits, at least for now. Tomorrow morning, me and Flyboy will go back out. Try to find a quiet residential zone. There might be some pills there." Flyboy was about to argue the toss, but knew it would do no good. "So I guess we're going back out in the AM, he said to Victor. "I tend to work better on 4 hours sleep anyway." Shane began to march towards the doors, laden with around 100 pounds of weaponry and useless implements, what he would have given to be carrying at least a box of medicine. "You're not going anywhere tomorrow," Victor suddenly snapped. Shane stopped walking and spun around. His face suggested that he was not to be pushed further. Victor decided not to heed the warning. "I'm sending my men. I run shit around here. It's the reason why so many fucking people are still alive. You think you could do any better? Last I heard, you were busting out of jail with your fellow villains." He pointed to the door across the roof. The villains he was referring to were Jared, who was nothing of notability, and Terry Lewis, who had once again found God and was about as vicious now as a poodle in a marshmallow factory. Shane could have launched at Victor. "Thanks," Flyboy sardonically said. "If you want me to teach one of your grunts how to fly her, just let me know." "Son, I wouldn't if I were you," Victor sneered. The loose skin that had once been taut to his face wobbled as he spoke. To Shane, he said, "So are we going to have a problem? Or are you going to do what I say when I say it, so that we can all just get along?" A hatchet, Shane thought. That would do nicely. Right in the top of the head, so that his eyeballs popped out of their sockets and dangled around his chin. "We're not going to have a problem," Shane lied. "Then it's settled," Victor said, with an expression that suggested he was more than satisfied with himself. His reluctance to back down against someone twice his junior made it feel as if he were back in charge of his old platoon. "My men leave at dawn with you," he pointed to Flyboy again. "And you can try to stay out of my way from now on," he said to Shane. Shane didn't think it warranted a response, so he didn't give one. He picked up the rucksack and made his way inside to where the rest of the group were waiting, hopeful and tired. The main electricity had been down for almost 2 weeks, and the entire compound was operating thanks to the perpetual rumblings of 3 20-kilowatt generators. The only problem with these, however, was that they used diesel, and at some point or other, they would consume whatever fuel they had, which would mean that a scavenger would have to attempt to locate some replacement fuel. Nobody in the group seemed to know how the generators worked, just that they did. As long as there was light and a few bars of fire, the survivors were happy. Terry Lewis liked to sit down in the basement alone. There was something about the steady, rhythmic hum of the jinnies that relaxed him. He even had an armchair down there. Granted, it wasn't the comfiest of seats, although he was hoping that he might stumble across one soon, perhaps in an antique furniture depot. But it was his, and as he sat, listening to the monotonous rumbles kicking out of the 3 huge machines that shared the room with him, he read the Bible. It had been a gift from Shane, who had discovered it while they were still behind bars. Terry didn't treasure any of his other possessions. What was there to get attached to? A pair of shoes? A new cane? But if anyone tried to relieve him of his Bible, he knew that he would kill them. As the generators slowed to a less frantic pace, Terry flipped the page and found himself staring down at the beginning of Revelations, like he needed to read about the 4 horsemen. He began, though, because things had changed so drastically now. Everything was different. The world and all of its glory had ceased to exist as they knew it. They were at ground zero, and the only way to look was forward. And the Bible, Terry Lewis's most treasured possession, was different now, too. Now that the apocalypse had arrived, and it had, with great presence, the Bible made more sense. Perhaps Terry was interpreting it the way he saw fit, changing the text to suit the event. But no matter which way he looked at it, the Bible appeared to have been written for this very time. With hope, Terry read further into Revelations, for he knew that somebody somewhere out there was doing exactly the same thing. "Terry?" a voice called from the head of the middle staircase. Terry jumped with a start before placing a bookmark between the pages of the Bible and closing it. "Are you down here?" It was Jared, Terry's ex-cellmate back in Jackson. He was a good kid, albeit a little wimpy and naive. Jared treated Terry as a father figure, somebody to look up to aspire to keep his ass alive for long enough to reach middle age. "I'm down here," Terry said, pushing himself out of the armchair and stretching like a cat who had just roused from a particularly pleasant nap. There was footfall, a metallic tap-tap-tap as Jared edged down the stairs and into the basement. When he appeared, Terry could see that he was disappointed. His face hung low, with a jaw that threatened to drop off at any given moment, and his eyes were sparkling with impending tears. "What's the matter?" Terry said, closing the gap between them. "You look like you've been diagnosed with fucking cancer." "Shane and Flyboy are back," Jared said. "Shane reckons the city is filled with lurkers. They didn't get anything tonight." Terry relaxed a little. "Thank fuck for that," he exhaled. "For a minute there I thought you were gonna tell me one of them had been bit." Jared smiled. "No, nothing that bad, but that ain't exactly good news either." He dropped his shoulders, clearly disappointed and visibly despondent. "I don't know how much longer some of those people up there are going to last without medicine," he continued. "Old man Mardigan is on his last legs." "He'll be fine," Terry said, hoping that he was right. "Old man Mardigan has survived wars worse than this one. I don't think he's going to let a little cold finish him off, do you?" Jared shrugged. "I guess not." "Right," Terry said. "I'm going to have a word with Shane. See if there's anything I can do to help. In the meantime, I want you to go to sleep. You look like a fucking addict." This brought a chuckle out of Jared, who, up until that point, looked apt to burst into tears. "Haven't touched anything in years, man," Jared whispered. "One good thing about prison." Terry sighed and smiled, both of which were perfunctory. At least he had succeeded in making Jared feel a little better. He headed up the stairs in search of perhaps the group's least favorite man of the hour. 3. The main hall was a hive of commotion. It looked as if everyone, children included, had made their way in to discover just how badly the night's scavenge had gone. Shane was at the side of the room, trying to calm himself down. It wasn't good practice to kick off against the enraged survivors, but their lack of understanding was justified. If they had seen, though, the mass of lurkers beneath the chopper, they would have been offering him congratulations on a decision well made. As it stood, they were just feeling sorry for themselves. Arguments around the room were erupting into actual violence. A fight between two of Victor Lord's men became the main focus of attention, with children trying to get a better view of the tussle. "Oh well," Shane thought. "While they're watching those two dickheads kick the shit out of each other, they're not questioning me." Terry Lewis, complete with Bible, sidled up next to Shane. He was perhaps the only man in the room that Shane wanted to talk to right now. "Bad night, huh?" Terry said, glancing down at the leather-bound cover of the love of his life. Shane wondered if Terry would ever stop with the gratitude. It was a book, for fuck's sake. Nothing more than words. "You could say that," Shane grimaced. He reached into one rucksack and pulled out 2 bottles of water. Handing one to Terry, he said, "There were just too fucking many of them. We wouldn't have stood a chance." "If it helps," Terry said, unscrewing the bottle and taking a small sip. "I don't blame you. Some of these people, they don't have a clue what we went through. Most of them were picked up before it got real ugly. Shit, I'd be surprised if even half of them have seen a horde yet. Shock the shit out of them, that would. He took a larger swig of water before continuing. I'm not sure who these people look up to, but it sure as shit ain't any of us. That son of a bitch captain thinks he owns them. Treats them like goddamned POWs or something he just trod in. Shane nodded. He's got it coming, he said. I could have tossed him off the fucking roof a half hour ago. Terry laughed. Why didn't you? Shane looked down to Terry's Bible and tapped the cover. If all of this has taught me one thing, he said, it's that demons and angels exist. I'm pretty sure I don't want to come back as one of those fucking things, so I'm trusting the man upstairs to take care of me. The man upstairs, Terry smiled, would have probably made you his right-hand man if you'd kicked that prick's ass over the edge. Now, I am a man of God, and I don't condone murder, at least not anymore. But do you really think he'd be missed around here? Her natural beauty had always been there, but with makeup and a nice dress, she was divine. I swear to God, Shane, Marla began, before realizing that they were in the presence of Terry. Sorry, Terry. I'm just a little worked up is all. No offense taken, Terry smiled, and it was the smile of a wise man, the kind of heartwarming expression you would get from your own grandfather. Shane and I were just discussing our apparent president. Martha thought for a moment, and then it clicked. Oh, you mean Victor, Lord of the fucking Manor. Do as I say or my buddies will shoot you in the face, that one? Shane smiled. And how has your day been, Marla? She sighed. Apart from worrying my ass off about you the whole time, and then finding somebody I hate more than Charles Dean, it's been one of the best days of my life. Charles Dean had been the governor of the prison at which she worked, and Shane and Terry were incarcerated. One mean bastard that wouldn't have looked out of place as a Bond villain. Glad to hear it, Shane said. His spirits were lifting by the second, which was what decent friends were for. From what I hear, Marla said, checking around to make sure that nobody was in earshot, you've been grounded. Holy shit, Shane whistled. How many survivors we got here? 30, maybe 40? And it's taken less than half an hour for that shit to get back to me, he had. Terry simply placed a hand on the cover of the Bible, as if in silent prayer for Shane. Oh, come on, Shane suddenly snapped. My wife and daughter could still be out there, alive, stuck somewhere where I can get to them. It was true. Shane had spoken of his family a lot, and it was the not knowing that had started to take its toll. You're not serious, Marla sneered. They could be alive, sure. You knew that anyway. But say they are, huh? And they're out there. Do you have any idea how unlikely it is of you finding them? They could be fucking anywhere. A needle in a haystack doesn't even begin to cover it. She's right, Terry said. Even if you found them, you might wish you hadn't even gone a-looking. What if they're turned? What if you had to look into your daughter's eyes and, I don't mean to step out of line here, there's nothing left inside them? Could you live with that? Shane knew that he could. It would be easier to live with than what he was going through now. He hadn't expected them to understand, and he had prepared for that very scenario. I'm going, he said. I have to. You're safe here, at least for now, and I'll be back in a few days, with or without my family. Oh, hell no, Marla said, shaking her head as if there was a piece of recalcitrant gum stuck in her hair. I am not staying here with those idiots. She gestured to the soldiers who were now dusting themselves down and explaining themselves to Victor Lord, who looked furious. If you're going, then I'm coming with you. Shane was about to object when Terry held his Bible aloft. Me too, Terry said. We'll be taken care of. You have my word. Marla gave Shane a smug grin, one that said he had very little choice in the matter. Realizing he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, Shane sighed. Okay, but if we're going to do this, then we're going to do it right. I'm thinking we leave first thing, before sunup. That way we'll be gone before that prick Victor gets up for his morning shit. I assume we're taking a vehicle, Terry said, not intending it to be a question. One of the Jeeps, Shane replied. He'd given it a lot of thought, and the Land Rover Snatch was probably the most secure vehicle they had available. Armored glass, mesh screen, Barracuda thermal insulation. There was no point taking one of the Defenders, of which they had two. A Defender was marginally quicker, but if a horde of lurkers managed to get a hold of it, they would tear it to parts in minutes. And then they would tear the passengers into pieces in roughly the same amount of time. Victor is not gonna fucking like this, Marla said, although the way in which she said it suggested a certain happiness at the fact. We'll be gone for a few days, a week at most, Shane said. Jackson ain't that far. We'll do it in 12 hours, max. Then we've just got to hope that all the lurkers have headed on to somewhere else, find your family, convince them to come back with us, and Bob's your mother's brother. Mother didn't sound convinced with the plan, although it had been her own idea to sign up. Sounds like a pretty fucking fine plan to me, Terry chuckled. I'll make sure that Jared's awake in plenty of time. Shane, for a moment, forgot all about Terry's ex-cellmate. It wasn't that he disliked him, it was that he was liable to get them all killed. Jared was simply not up to busting Zombie's skull, and taking him along was a risk that Shane hadn't even considered. I know that look, Terry said. You honestly think he's going to stay here? Especially if I'm going? Not a chance. Shane sighed. Agreed, Terry said, a smile creeping onto his face. I'll go talk to him, make sure he understands your terms. In the meantime, he said, pointing across to Victor Lord, who was still berating his men as if they were at kindergarten, get what you need together and stay out of that prick's way. If he gets wind of this, he'll lock us all down. And I don't know about you, but I've had enough of middle bars and one meal a day. Terry turned and headed off through the double doors at the opposite end of the room. He's getting on a bit, Marla said. Do you think he'll be able to keep up? Shane shrugged his shoulders. It was a good question, and one that he was a little unsure of answering. Well, let's put it this way, he said. What choice has he got? 4. The sweat poured down his face and onto his pastel blue shirt, staining it like a Rorschach test, until he was red in the face. When he managed to compose himself once again, Susie Bloom dabbed the sweat on his brow with an already sodden handkerchief. What's the matter? She asked, referring to his sudden bout of hysterics. Told yourself a joke that you hadn't heard before? He shook his head, fighting back another coughing fit. I was just thinking, he said. Do you know how old I am? I'll tell you. I'm old enough to remember the moon. Whatever the old man said next probably wouldn't be as funny to her as it was to him. It's taken the dead to rise to make me piss in my shorts. With that he burst into yet another uncontrollable cackle. Susie couldn't help but join in. He was infectious, at least in the comedic states. By God, she hoped he wasn't infectious in any other way. Just then, as the pair laughed together, Kelly Bloom appeared and sat herself down next to Max. Kelly was Susie's daughter, and despite her youth, she was 8 1/2, although she would like to tell people she was almost 8 3/4. She knew more than most adults could ever dream of knowing. What's so funny? She asked, smiling along. It really was infectious. Max, you look like you seriously need to take a breath. He coughed, spluttered, composed himself, and then started laughing all over again. Max and I were just talking, Susie said. He was just telling me about the war. Kelly's expression turned to one of confusion. Well, that's not funny, she said, arching her eyebrows. You old people sure do some strange things. Max, still laughing and choking, said, We do. We really do. But you'll realize, young Kelly, that when you reach my age, nothing really matters anymore. Somebody will be there doing everything for you, wiping bits that you haven't even thought about for over a decade. And in the meantime, you're left with a giant void to fill. Take it from me. Laughter is probably the best way to fill the void. Kelly had no idea what the old man was rambling on about, but it appeared to make sense to her mother, who was looking on with a mixture of intrigue and acknowledgement. Kelly, why don't you go play with Sam? Susie said as she wiped the sweat from Max's face. Mom, Kelly whined. I know he's the same age as me, but that doesn't mean we have to be best friends. Nobody said that you have to marry him, Susie sniggered. Just go and talk to him while Mommy finishes up over here. Kelly sighed, a massive exhalation that was both forced and exaggerated. Okay, she said, but I'm only doing it because you asked nicely, and if he annoys me, I'm going to tell him that he's an idiot. Max, she can be a handful at times. The thing about bringing up a smart kid is that they soon become aware of just how fucking smart they are. She straightened up Max's shirt as if she was preparing him for his first day at school. He smiled as she did it. Once she found out she was cleverer than your average whippersnapper, it's been a battle of wits. Max pushed himself forward onto his elbows. Too long spent lying on the cold, hard floor had numbed his ass to the point of no return. Well, he said, she should do just fine, despite this chaos. Susie didn't like to see the old man in such discomfort, but it was to be expected. A 97-year-old man stricken with flu could only put on an act of defiance for a while. Max Mardigan was reaching the end of his bravery display. Susie knew that the man would be dead soon. Age wasn't the problem. It was the pneumonia that would surely take a pop at him, or the toll on his brittle heart. It saddened her deeply to even ponder how long he had left, but he didn't seem to mind. And he knew better than anyone else. Perhaps it was the fact that the planet had gone to hell in a handbasket that removed the fear of death. At least he wouldn't be returning as one of the infected, not if he died in the compound. Susie knew which way she would rather go, and it didn't involve being torn limb from limb by a horde of flesh-eating zombies. I don't suppose there are any pills left for an old man like me, Max grunted, though he already knew the answer. Susie shook her head. They didn't bring any back with them, she said. I'll check with the captain, but I don't think there are any left in storage. She rolled back onto her haunches and gripped his cold, roomy hand between her own. You're going to be just fine, she said, offering him the most reassuring smile she could muster. Kinda doubt it, he grinned, his teeth a little stained from years of dental neglect and caffeine addiction. It was better than the alcoholism that he had succumbed to in his earlier years. She left to find out if there were any pills to ease the old man's pain and suffering. By the time she returned, Max Mardigan had died, peacefully, or at least more peacefully than at the hands of the Horde. 5. She moved through the night, ignoring the groans floating along on the wind. She hadn't seen any creatures yet, which only served to put her on edge even further. She could hear them, though, which meant that they were local, probably sniffing around the town for the remnants of flesh that was still edible. As the wind carried their moans across to her, a shiver ran the course of her spine, No matter how many days she spent hiding from them, survived a 32-inch plasma screen with the newest system hooked up to it. Fucking morons. But their stupidity was a good thing. Supplies were still quite easy to come by, provided you didn't mind venturing out from safety to gather them. The water supplies were dwindling, though. One thing the looters soon realized was that the water supply carried the infection. Bottled water was the only way, but it must have been too late by then. Half of the town had become infected. Quite how the supply had gotten tainted uniform it had no doubt been attacked in, and why wouldn't it? It wasn't as if they had the gumption to change clothing whenever it got bloody or covered in visceral matter. If that were the case, the laundry would have one hell of a line. This particular member of the undead had been a paramedic, his green and yellow high-vis clothing now besmirched and torn. He was moving pretty quickly, considering the fact he was missing an entire foot. Instead of slowing it down, it dragged the stump along at staggering speed. She had never seen one move so rapidly. It could become a problem. She reached across to her back and pulled out the machete which had been strapped there. Freshly sharpened that very same day, she had been bored out of her mind, and reading yet another book about sparkly fucking vampires just wasn't going to cut it. It was primed to go, and she had the ideal candidate to test it out on. As the dead paramedic shuffled forward at what must have been the zombie equivalent of breakneck speed, she waited, controlled her breathing, listened to the pained vocalizations of other creatures in the area. They were distant, and probably no real threat to her, although she hadn't heard the creature she was now looking at. It paid to be very careful in the moments to follow. With its back to her, facing the store and standing in the way of her and the vital supplies which she needed to survive, she knew she had the best opportunity she was going to get. She sprang forth from behind the bin, covering the space between herself and the creature in remarkably good time. It must have heard her, though, or maybe sensed something was about to happen, if that were at all possible, because it started to turn. She swung the machete, whipping it through the air more accurately than she could ever have hoped for, given the fact that she was terrified. Her momentum and the adrenaline pumping through her kept her aim true. There was a choking noise as she landed a few feet away from the thing, and she turned in time to watch the aftermath of what she had just done. The creature stood motionless, confused. It stared towards her, its eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. Black ooze seeped from between its lips, which had been torn open on one side to reveal a complete set of teeth and half a jawbone. It gurgled, staggered a few inches this way and that, and then its head slipped aside, sliding down the severed neck and landing with a meaty thump on the road next to its still-standing body. She pushed herself up, knowing that she had finished the fucker off adequately. The body fell, just crumpled like a sack of potatoes, and without further thought she made her way towards the store, wiping a blackened thorax from the blade of the machete on her leg as she went. The store window was smashed through, and shattered glass peppered the pavement, crunching beneath her feet as she entered through the double doors. Surprisingly, the doors remained intact, which just went to show the mentality of looters. If in doubt, clamber through the window. She was surprised to find that supermarket music was still playing, albeit quietly. Nevertheless, it made the entire scenario that little bit creepier. The lights were off in the main shopping area, but the occasional luminescent flicker from a room at the back provided enough light for her to work by. She traveled light these days. It was the only way. If you find yourself bogged down with items of indulgence and all of a sudden a horde descends on you, the likelihood of the fridges and the food contained within them. It was dead food, no good for anything. She'd learned this the hard way after a night of utter madness and a cheese and onion pasty. Tins. They were the only safe food. She grabbed 3 tins of beans, 1 spaghetti, several chili, and an Irish stew. She didn't want to carry too much tonight. It was bad enough that she was out after dark, but sleep had evaded her yet again, and boredom had forced her out into the night. She located the water and grabbed 3 bottles, one with a strawberry-flavored kick simply for something different. She would have to remember not to wash her hair with that one. With the water and meals secured for the next few days, she had time to scan the hardware section. She was almost out of twine, and knives were always useful. She bagged them and managed to find a thicker coat in her size. Fuck, it was getting cold. Wearing the new coat and carrying pretty much everything she needed to get by the next few days in reasonable comfort, she headed for the entrance, machete drawn just in case the situation outside had changed any. Suddenly there was a clatter from behind. She whirled on the spot, expecting to find the worst. She was relieved to be faced with nothing, at least nothing in her general area. But the noise came from somewhere. The room at the end of aisle 7, from where the flickering light emanated. The handle, ready to fight with, well, cereal, apparently. There came another clatter, and this one turned her legs to jelly. She had to pull herself together, and quick. She edged towards the light, which buzzed every time it flickered. She was like a moth, drawn to the luminescent glow. She reached the doors and took a deep, silent breath. Raising the machete to optimum height, she slowly pushed herself into the room, which was a stock-covered Coombe storage depot. She didn't have to look too closely to locate the source of the noise. A rat, no, several rats, had managed to chew their way through most of the stock. They didn't even realize they were being watched as they tucked into a torn can of potato chips. The can rolled from side to side as 3 miniature mouths attempted to get at the chips. One rat appeared at the tubular entrance of the can, crumbs around its mouth. Obviously, the best way to get at the food was to climb in and work your way outwards. The other rats seemed jealous and confused, and scampered away in all directions in search of other tasty morsels. She turned, smiling to herself. How had she managed to get so worked up? And then she saw them. That was how she had managed to terrify herself. And that was the reason why the rats were hanging around. They just had to wait for their food to die properly. 2 girls, Asian, small, were chained to the far side of the storage room. They began to growl as she made her way towards them. 12, maybe 13, but the decay made them look a lot older and a hell of a lot scarier. She couldn't believe the way some people's minds worked. The parents, who she presumed were the proprietors of the store, must have had the bright idea to constrain their daughters, gone off in search of a cure, and ended up being either eaten alive or infected, which left the girls chained to the shelving rack like misbehaved dogs. She had to do something. She couldn't just leave them there like that. Sure, they were infected, but that didn't make it right to desert them. They would go on living, in the undead sense of the word, of course, until either more of the creatures stumbled upon them and finished them off. Did they even do that? Or until the rats decided that there was nothing left food-wise and made a go for them. The only reason the rats were keeping their distance at the moment was they knew just how hungry the little Asian girls were, perhaps hungrier even than they were. As she approached, the girl on the right snapped forward. The chains rattled the pole they were attached to. Growling, licking her lips, and pushing out black goo until the drool was long enough to touch the ground, the creature clearly displayed her hunger and her intentions. It took less than a second to raise the machete, 3 seconds in total to decapitate both of them. In the end, 4, the kind of snow that would stick. There was a frost on the ground, which didn't help matters. The barracks, though, seemed to glow as the snow landed, highlighting each and every turret, every single angular construct. In the distance, lurkers moaned and howled. It made Shane wonder if the weather had anything to do with it, although he doubted it. It could have been pissing fire or hailing razor blades, and they wouldn't have reacted any differently. Shane couldn't sleep. He was too worked up for the days ahead, and the notion that he would find his wife and daughter one way or the other. Deciding to go for a run around the compound, however, might not have been his brightest idea ever, despite the fact that he was wearing a Helican base layer and a Fox Mark III fleece. The freezing air made him realize just how cold it was. And now it was snowing, and each flake was sticking to his fleece like white on rye. The khaki-green fleece was soon peppered, making him look ridiculous, like a lost snowman. His breath fogged in the air in front of his face as he ran the training circuit. He wasn't a military man, and he'd never had ambition to be one, but fitness seemed to mean a lot these days. If you couldn't run, then you might as well just lie down and let the pain commence, because these things would keep on coming until they got you. Unlike humans, which they clearly no longer were, they didn't feel pain, get a stitch, run out of breath. They were relentless, and although they didn't move as quickly, all it took was one at close proximity and you were fucked. Shane didn't want to be fucked. Something off in the distance exploded, and for a moment Shane stopped in his tracks. It was far away, perhaps a mile or two, but every time there was a loud noise, it made you think. Shane wondered if there were any powers out there still capable of dropping a nuke, leveling the cities and starting over from scratch. Surely they would have done that by now if they had survived, although nuking cities pretty much rendered them obsolete and practically uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. But this was the government's? Shane knew that they weren't the smartest tools in the drawer. Shit. The cities were uninhabitable anyway, with those cannibalistic sons of bitches everywhere you looked. Might as well take them out and wait for the debris to stop falling. That, he thought, was the kind of mentality that the government harbored. Brushing the explosion off in the distance as nothing more than a burnt-out car, Shane resumed his run. He needed to be careful now, though. The snow underfoot had turned the ground to mush. One false move, one misplaced boot, and he would slip, bust his neck, and be out of the fucking world in the most anticlimactic way imaginable. He decided to call it a night. No point in putting himself at risk, not when he would be spending the whole of the next week doing exactly that. He turned and headed back to the main compound. Packing for the mission would take an hour. After that, they were out of there, on the road to oblivion. He was old, Terry said, placing himself down on the makeshift bed. At least he's in a better place now. Jared moved across the room, like a boy on his first day of school. Yeah, but he looked so fit when we first got in here, he said. Looked like he could take on any one of us in a fight. Shane wasn't paying too much attention to the conversation, but he knew that they were talking about Max Mardigan. Was it wrong that he had very little interest in that right now? There were things more important than an old man dying, at least he thought so, his family for one, who could still be alive. Are alive, he reminded himself, still are alive. He stuffed more clothing into his Bergen, knowing that he had to draw the line soon, or risk being weighed down. Well, if you ask me, Marla joined in, he's gone out of this to him. Thanks. Now, can we stop talking about old man Mardigan? He's gone out of here for good. So let's just concentrate on what we need to do. Remember? The living? The three stared at him silently. It was a shame that they weren't used to, and one that none of them really cared for. Marla, Shane said, sensing that there was an uncomfortable silence that needed breaking. Did you manage to get the keys I asked for? She reached into her pocket and retrieved a set of keys. Easier than I expected, she said, smiling. Obviously, her sexuality had paid off once again. The prick didn't even realize what I was up to. I'm sure he thought I was going to kiss him. Victor Lord was many things, and that included a lecherous old slime bag. The snatch was his. Well, technically it belonged to the barracks, but since he was pretty much running the show, or liked to think he was, he held the keys at all times. But not anymore. Good, Shane said. He's gonna know it was you, though. You do realize that. She sighed. Then a huge smile lit up her face. I'm counting on it, she said. Otherwise, what was the point in getting so close to his cigar-stinking face? "Right," Shane said authoritatively. "I'm taking it that you're all set, because there's no coming back once we hit the road, at least, not for a while." Terry pushed himself up from the mattress, which creaked beneath him as if exhaling with relief. "Got my bag packed, but turns out I like to travel light." He lifted the tiniest satchel imaginable from the floor and dropped it onto the mattress. "Got everything I need right here." Shane shook his head. "Weapons," he said. "We need to figure out what we're taking weapons-wise." Jared nervously stepped forward. It seemed like he was waiting for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he was going to make the most of it. "I already thought about that," he said, a slight... "Because I don't think they're big fans?" Jared stopped unzipping the bag long enough to cast her a cautionary glance. "Wow, you're really funny," he said sarcastically. He pulled the zip across all the way and pulled out possibly the farthest thing from a hockey stick that you could get. A Remington shotgun. "Jesus Christ, Jared!" Shane panted, mesmerized by the weapon in Jared's hands. In truth, it looked like it should be in anybody's hands except for Jared. "Where in the hell did you get that?" Jared grinned, knowing that he had impressed the group. "You know Moon, the tall guy? Beard?" Shane knew David Moon. He also knew that stealing his weapon was a mistake that even he wouldn't have made. "You're talking about the big guy?" Shane said, faking enthusiasm. "The large man who'd probably kick the living shit out of you if he knew what you had done?" "That sounds like him," Jared said, cocking the shotgun. Marla moved a few feet back, avoiding the barrel completely. "Well, that's a mighty fine weapon," Terry said, taking it away from Jared, who clearly had no use for it other than as a bludgeon. He removed the shells from it and slipped it back into the hockey bag. "You did good, Jared. Very good." Jared smiled with teeth. Thank you," he said, still stuttering. "So we have a gun," Marla said. "Anything else?" Shane had a pistol, .22 caliber, clean, probably never been fired. None of the others dared to ask where he had managed to swipe it from, which was probably for the best. He also had knives, lots of knives, although they were only good in close quarters, and as they all knew, being in close quarters with one of those things was about the last place you wanted to find yourself. Shane handed a large knife to Terry, who looked at it with an amalgamation of horror and confusion. "If it comes to it," he said, "I'd much rather you just took them out quickly with the shotgun." Shane shook his head. "Unfortunately, Padre," he said, smiling, "I don't think we'll have that luxury. Not often, anyway. You know as well as I do that a shotgun blast will just draw more of them. Before we know it, they'd be everywhere. No, knives are safer. Quieter, anyhow." Terry slipped the knife into his satchel. It barely fit, and he knew he would have to be careful not to make any sudden movements or risk the blade jabbing through the leather and spilling the rest of his supplies. "I think we're good to go," Shane said, shouldering his Bergen. "Anybody got anything prolific to say?" Jared looked to Terry, who turned to Marla. They all shook their heads. "Then let's get the fuck out of here," Shane said, "before that prick Victor drags his slimy ass out of bed." They headed for the snatch. Not something she relished. Plus, she was absolutely shattered. Her bed was calling to her, and the quickest way to it was also the only way. She leapt the fence, which was only 3 feet high, but still quite a challenge for someone of her height, and drew her machete. In the moonlight, she could see that the blade still carried remains on it, but they had congealed by now, making them almost impossible to remove. Something for later, she thought. She moved around the perimeter of the field, trying to stay as close to the fence as possible while still maintaining forward movement. 3 men, 1 woman. The woman, or the zombie equivalent of a woman, continuously fell down, burying herself in the long grass before popping back up a few moments later. Under other circumstances, it would have been quite entertaining to watch. When you were tired, though, and just wanted to fall into a soft mattress and close your stinging eyes, it was more of a nuisance than anything else. She edged forward, stepping away from the fence, away from safety. Bed. 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 Two of the creatures seemed to respond to each other, not with words or anything close to them, but the way in which they grunted and motioned made her wonder about the level of communication that they could achieve, if any. It was all academic now, though, as she was going to have to interrupt their conversation, split it down the middle with a very sharp blade. She ran, the bag of supplies clattering against her shins as she raced forward. When she was close enough to engage, she tossed the bag aside and lunged for the first creature. It didn't know what had hit it. It never would. Its head shot through the air, blackened tendrils fluttering from the stump. Where it landed, she had no clue, and she wasn't about to go looking for it afterwards, just in case he had been wearing nice earrings. As if the others knew what was happening, which only enforced her belief that they knew more of what was going on than she first believed, the second and third creature exchanged glances. One, who was wearing a police uniform and wore a mustache that might have gone out of fashion in the 70s, grunted at the other, and then they were both lurching for her, grasping at the air in front of them as if it would propel them forward faster. She staggered backwards a few feet, keeping a close eye on the female, who had just bobbed up 10 feet away and had noticed the fresh meat on offer. She could see the house across the field, inviting, impossible to reach, or so it seemed at that moment. She lifted the machete. She hadn't noticed until now just how heavy it was. Perhaps the previous kills had taken it out of her. Making another mental note, this time to get a lighter weapon as soon as possible, she hopped forward to where the second and third creatures stood. Biggest mistake of her life. Sensing that she was outnumbered, both of them floundered for her simultaneously. She realized how stupid she had been almost immediately and managed to reposition herself just in time to avoid the worst possible death. The cop creature grabbed her wrist, clawing at her coat, trying to break through and infect her with its disease. She dropped the machete down, level with the creature's groin, and lunged. There was a meaty squelch, and she pushed herself to the right in an attempt to evade the second creature, which was snapping for her shoulder with discolored teeth. Inky froth erupted from both of the creature's mouths, in unison almost, keeping the second creature at bay for long enough, just. She pushed upwards on the machete handle. There was a crunch, followed by another hellish splat as the blade sliced through the thing up to its throat. The female thing was getting closer all the time. She yelped as the second creature once again snapped at her with ooze-dripping teeth. She could smell its breath, or just the fact that it was dead and had been for quite some time. If she had had time to gag, she would have. She managed to position herself just right to finish. Don't let it scratch you. She swung the machete this way and that before she managed to find a target. It meant resistance, but only momentarily. As the blade sliced through the thing's leg and out the other side, the creature, suddenly off balance, slipped away, its grip loosening. And she knew she had to be quick. She finished it before it had a chance to hit the ground. The good old decapitation worked every time, and the thing's head disappeared off into the distance, a trail of blood staining the grass behind it. She gasped for air, but there didn't appear to be any, and what there was tasted of death and putrefied matter. No time to panic, no time for anything. The female was now barely 10 feet away, and it was clear now why she had been finding it difficult to remain on her feet. She only had one. The other had been taken, torn off perhaps, by the creatures that had infected her. The stump was surrounded by fishnet stockings, torn and dangling and bloody as hell. She could practically hear her bed calling to her now. And she had managed to take out the main threat, although it was not wise to discriminate when it came to the flesh-eating undead. Male or female, it made no difference. They were equally as strong, and had only one purpose in death, to devour the living. The one-legged woman dragged herself forward. Her eyes were so deeply sunk in their sockets that they were invisible. If it wasn't for the moonlight hitting the solid blackness within those eyes, the woman would have looked completely blind. With the machete raised high and her breath suitably recovered, well, at least enough for one more battle, she charged, hoping that the creature would go down easy. It did. It took 2 swipes of the blade. The first merely scalped the creature, which could have ended very badly, but luckily didn't. The second whoosh of the machete severed the head at the nose, which was more than enough to finish the creature off. As the top of its head landed at its feet, a volcano of darkness shot skywards, glistening in the moonlight, before making its way back down. The body crumpled, twitched for a few seconds, and then stopped. She checked around, making sure that there were no more of them. The coast looked clear, which was good, because she felt apt to collapse if she didn't make it to the house in time. As she stealthily headed for the house across the field, she tried to remember what life had been like before the virus destroyed mankind. They were likely to question why a group of survivors were taking the only decent vehicle they had off the grounds, especially in the middle of the night. Technically, it was almost 6, but it was still dark, apart from the ever-increasing layer of snow on the ground. He drove carefully, making sure that the brakes didn't lock up and send them aquaplaning across the drill square. "Who taught you how to drive?" Marla said from the back. "Miss Daisy?" Shane glanced across his shoulder to find that she was right up against the cage. A beautiful, perfect face, despite the terrors she had witnessed. "You forget," Shane said, taking the Jeep over a set of double speed bumps. "I've only recently got out of prison. To be fair, I wasn't the greatest driver in the world before I went in." Terry laughed, noting the playful tone in Shane's voice. Jared, on the other hand, grabbed onto a leather strap hanging from the roof in the back. He looked more nervous than he ever had before. He had opted for the back with Marla, not because it was safer. It was, marginally, but because he didn't really want to get involved should they encounter trouble along the way. If he had taken the passenger seat up front, and a horde of fucking undead decided to amble into the middle of the road, who do you think would have to get out and help take care of them? He knew very well who, so without seeming like the weakest member of the group, he had nominated Terry to ride up front, and cited the elder chance of becoming alienated too. Disengaging from the others would maybe cause disaffection, which was not what anyone wanted, since they had no idea how long they would be cooped up there. The snow was falling heavy, coating everything in sight. There must have been a brisk wind, too, since the snow rotated and span in tight circles, like mini tornadoes. Up ahead, Shane could see the gate. Terry had to squint to make it out, as his eyesight was not as good as it had once been. "Are there any of them out there?" Marla asked, edging closer to the grate that separated the up-front riders from her and Jared. "Can you even see?" Shane could see the gate, but beyond that there was nothing. At least nothing visible through the thickening snow. "I don't think so," Terry said. In truth, there could have been a fucking horde the size of Kentucky on the other side of the gate. He just couldn't see them. Glasses, should they become available at any point over the next few days, were a definite. Shane allowed the Jeep to roll the final 20 feet towards the gate, just in case there were lurkers within earshot. The snow crunched beneath the tires, though, which he was almost certain they would have heard. He stopped the snatch and applied the handbrake. Somebody had to get out and open the gate, and he knew that Jared would be the last to volunteer. It was pointless asking. He pulled the handle on his door and stepped out into the freezing night. Or was it morning yet? It was unclear, since the darkness hadn't altered much or begun to make way for dawn. "Be careful," Shane heard Marla say from the back of the Jeep. He almost replied with something sarcastic, but chose not to. It was hardly the time for a smart mouth, and he was too busy using his tongue to prevent his teeth from chattering together. The gate itself was, as expected for a military facility, pretty sturdy. Shane knew that it was chained several times to stop the hordes from breaking through. There had been an electrical lock on the gate when they arrived at the barracks, but not anymore. The generators were starting to struggle, and they had voted against the pointless extravagance of an electric lock on the main entrance, in favor of 3 huge fucking chains and padlocks. It made sense, technically, since the lurkers were just as stuck on the outside either way. 3 links of chain did the same job as a few wires and a hell of a lot of power. Shane grabbed the bolt cutters from the footwell and headed towards the gate. He could feel eyes upon him, and knew that if he was to turn round at that moment in time, there would be 3 people staring back intensely from the jeep. It made him a little uncomfortable, but he also felt a lot safer than if they hadn't been there. There was a clunk from behind. Shane turned to find Terry Lewis stepping out of the jeep. He was carrying a bag. Shane had almost forgotten the new padlocks. "Might as well come and help," Terry whispered, jogging slowly towards Shane. "Fuck me, it's cold." Shane smiled. "I think my nuts are actually frozen together." "Well," Terry grinned, still whispering, "if they get any worse, at least we've got the bolt cutters." They both made faces that suggested pain, although Shane actually felt a pang in his nether regions, as if they had been listening in on the conversation and decided to make their thoughts known. They set to work. Shane snipped the first chain, while Terry kept a lookout on both sides of the gate. "Seems like we're always trying to break out of somewhere," Terry said, bouncing up and down in an attempt to generate some body heat. "It seems that way," Shane added. "Only this time we know what we're doing. Or we hope we do." He thought, but didn't say. With the 3 chains cut, he pulled them out and lowered them to the ground. The snow was so deep now, already, that the links vanished entirely, leaving only the holes in the snow as proof that they even existed. Terry was about to pull the gate open when Shane whispered his name. "Not yet," he said. "Go get in the jeep. I'll pull the gate, but when I do, I need you driving through it. If there are any lurkers in the vicinity, we need to give them as little chance as possible of getting through. There are still people here, good people, and the last thing we want to do is leave them at the mercy of a fucking horde." Terry nodded, placed the bag of padlocks down in the snow before her to shut the fuck up, as there was nothing worse than a backseat driver. Shane took one deep breath and pulled the gate inwards. It was heavier than it looked, but the 2 inches of snow beneath it probably added to the resistance somewhat. Still, he pulled fast, knowing that time was of the essence, and the sooner he was back in the snatch, safe, the better. He waved towards Terry, signaling that the gate was wide enough to get the jeep through. Terry drove forward slowly, offering Shane a thumbs up as he passed. Marla was still rambling on about something, but the wind and snow whipping Shane's ears prevented him from hearing. With the snatch safely through, and at a stop on the other side, Shane grabbed the chains and almost pulled his back out, shutting the gate. He slipped the first chain through and padlocked it, then the second. He had the 3rd length of chain in his hand when Terry yelled from the window, "Shane! Over there!" Shane turned, saw the creature shuffling towards the jeep, and said, "Where the fuck did he come from?" It was alone, a single creature that had wandered off the beaten path, but its eyes contained a hunger that Shane was more than familiar with. "Whatever you do," Shane said, "stay in the jeep." He left the gate and began to edge closer to the lurker. From the jeep came the sounds of Marla panicking, while Terry gave her a running commentary on the events unfolding. Thank God it was just one. Shane knew that as the creature grasped for him, he sidestepped and wrapped the chain around its neck. It instantly fell to its knees, as Shane had anticipated, and began to struggle fiercely with the tightening steel around its throat. To no avail. Shane pulled once, which caused the creature's eyes to bulge and fall out of their sockets. The second pull, complete with an almighty twist, severed the head from its body. As the viscous fluid sprayed from the neck stump, Shane turned his head aside, one minute drop. Shane drove and fought for breath. The last thing he had expected was a lecture. I had to kill it, Shane said. For all we know, it watched where we came from. I don't know how smart they are or if they communicate. But if that fucking thing could tell its friends where all the meat was hiding, it probably wouldn't be a good thing for those people in there. They wouldn't be able to get through the gate, Marla retorted. You said so yourself. Doesn't mean we should set them a challenge, Shane said. Plus, as soon as we finish, we need to be able to get back in. I don't know about you, but an army of dead standing in front of the gate might make that difficult. Marla fell silent. It wasn't that she had nothing to say. She had plenty and always did. It was because she knew that he was right. She kept forgetting that they would be returning. For some reason, it felt like a one-way mission. What's the fuel situation? Terry asked, placing the shotgun between his legs so that the barrel faced away from his ballsack. Shane checked the gauge. It looked okay. The needle sat somewhere between a quarter and a half tank, which would, or should, get them to where they needed to be. The Snatch, Shane guessed, was built to hold a fuckload of fuel, and a quarter of a tank would probably be the same amount of fuel to fill an ordinary car. We should be okay, Shane said. If we need a top-up anytime soon, I'll let you know. The Jeep rolled forward, towards the breaking dawn, towards Megan and Holly. Behind them, all hell was breaking loose. Victor Lord made his way down the stairs and into the main camp. The sea of tents and sleeping bags always reminded him of a rescue mission he had overseen in China after an 8.2 magnitude earthquake. The only real difference here, though, was the willingness to obey. The Chinese had been frantic, unable to understand, and pretty damn pissed off that their livelihoods had been reduced to ruin. The last thing to avoid the nip in the air, Victor surveyed the area the way any good captain would. There were 100 people here, stuffed into a room, and half the time it was difficult to tell whether any more had died during the night. You had to really look, check for movement on some of the older folks. The last thing he wanted was a room stinking of death and decay. The body of Max Mardigan had been removed almost immediately. His men had carried the body down to the storage room, where it would be incinerated at a later date. If anything, it would provide them with a little warmth, and as long as you didn't stand downwind from it, the stench wouldn't be too much of a problem. Victor stepped over a sleeping woman, didn't recognize her, but he was hardly there to make friends, and pulled the zip down on a dome tent. He crouched and peered in through the opening. "Everybody alive in there?" he asked, grinning like a shark amongst a school of plankton. An elderly lady stared back at him, obviously annoyed at the captain's severe lack of respect. Maggie Cox, silver-haired potty-mouth, said, "Captain, what the fuck? You would have had the shock of your life had my tits been swinging about the place." Victor smiled. "Lady, it's freezing. If you had your tits out, I would have been very surprised indeed." "You just go on and get the fuck out of here," Maggie said, her eyes darting around the tent in search of something. She found what she was looking for, a pack. "I ain't gonna die for a long fucking time. So just make your peace with it and move on." Victor smiled, artificial and insincere. In truth, he wouldn't mind the old hag dying. Her contributions to the camp were non-existent, and she had no, or very little, respect for him and his men. The least she could do was roll over and provide some extra kindling for the young and fit. Victor was about to say something he might have regretted when a panicked voice entered the room. "Captain, Captain, has anyone seen the captain?" Victor gave the old lady a grimace, just to confirm his hatred for her, as if she wasn't already aware, and backed out of the tent. Standing, he found David Moon, Stuart Randall, and Henry Colburn making their way through the camp. All of them looked worried, something Victor had never seen before in his men. "What is it?" Victor called, making his presence known. When they saw him, They breathed a sigh of relief. The survivors emerging from tents watched, trying to figure out what was going on. Obviously something bad. It was tattooed on the face of all who wore camouflage. David Moon stopped next to the captain. He was about to speak when he noticed the audience. Victor, on the other hand, looked on impatiently, awaiting the bad news. He really didn't give a fuck if the rest of the group heard. Just how bad could it possibly be? "We need to have a word," Moon said, pointing to the double doors at the end of the room. Victor sighed and began to walk. Heads turned to follow him out. People whispered amongst themselves, speculating on what the problem was. There was talk of generators failing, lurkers breaching the perimeter, outside contact with the CDC, and all manner of impossible things. When the double doors closed behind the military men, the group went about their morning rituals, nonplussed and indifferent. What could possibly have happened to worsen their current situation? "This had better be good," Victor said, as he shoved his unlit cigar into the corner of his mouth. One of these days he would light it, but not just yet. The three soldiers looked to each other, silently deciding on who should speak. In the end, it was David Moon. "It's Shane," Moon said. "He's fucked up proper this time." Victor clamped down on the cigar so hard that his jaw ached. "And what has the prick done now?" Moon sighed. "He's gone, sir. He's taken the snatch and, well, he's just gone. He's taken my shotgun, too, the son of a bitch." There were 3 pieces of information in Moon's statement. Victor Lord was only interested in one of them. "The snatch," he said. "The only decent fucking transport we have." Moon nodded. Behind him, the 2 silent soldiers exchanged nervous glances. "It seems that way," Moon replied. "But we think he has others with him. Couldn't find the doctor anywhere. And that Bible basher and his cellmate are missing. Sir, they've deserted us." It was freezing standing out in the corridor. The soldiers were visibly shivering, clenching their teeth together to prevent them from chattering, but Victor Lord, in that moment, felt as if his blood had turned to lava. "I don't give a fuck about those people," Victor said, chomping the cigar as if it had done him wrong. "The way I see it, it's 4 less mouths to feed. What I do care about, though, is my fucking Jeep. We need it. I need it. That prick's fucked up this time." 10. With sunrise came the hope of a thaw. It had only been snowing for a few hours, but the ground was covered, several inches thick in some places. The snatch was built for all terrain, but the tires slipped occasionally on the snow, and each time they did, panic ensued. "Jesus Christ," Martha said, leaning forward and stabilizing herself against the separating mesh. "Just doesn't feel safe to me." "We're fucked." "The lurkers can walk faster than that," Marla whispered. "Let's just hope we don't come across any. We're meals on wheels at the moment." The Jeep skidded a few feet to the right. Shane gripped the wheel and steadied it, trying not to panic, trying to look as though he had full control over the vehicle. "One hell of a road trip," Marla chided, settling back into her seat. When she realized that Jared was looking toward her expectantly, she said, "Oh, don't worry. Everything's under control. Well, everything apart from the fucking Jeep." Jared forced a smile. "Seems like it," he said. "I'm pretty sure I've shit my pants." Marla made a disgusted face. "Ew. You need to think before you speak." She laughed, which was cut off as the snatch slipped a foot to the left, complete with sound effects. "We're okay," Shane said from the front. "Just had to go around a body in the road." "What?" Jared said, more than terrified. "It's okay," Terry's voice added. "It wasn't a lurker, just Some poor son of a bitch who couldn't run quick enough. God rest his soul. Jared relaxed. I can't believe we left the barracks for this, he said. To Marla, he said, Is it possible to have a heart attack just sitting down? She nodded. That's good to know, he said. I'll add that to my list of things to look out for. Marla was going to reply when the snatch began to slow. It was quite a sudden halt, or at least it felt like it. But as far as she was aware, there was nothing to stop for. So what if the lights were red? You were never going to get a ticket, so you might as well just blast through them. She reached up and slammed a hand against the mesh, which rattled noisily. I said it's going to take us forever to get there, she said. That didn't include any stoppages. Marla, shut the fuck up, Terry whispered. The fear in his voice was palpable. We have a small problem. The engine switched off. Marla didn't know whether the Jeep had just cut out or if Shane had shut her down. She hoped it was the latter. Although even that had its drawbacks. It meant that something very bad was about to happen. And it was. Marla pushed herself up to look through the mesh, and immediately wished she hadn't. There were 8 of them, trundling through the snow towards the snatch. The bile caught in Marla's throat as panic hit her like a ton of bricks. It was a good job that Jared couldn't see what she could. He really would have shit in his pants. Instead, he sat quietly, aware that something terrible was about to happen, but too afraid to ask what. What do we do? Marla asked, keeping her voice low just in case. Shane? He shook his head and pulled the pistol from the side door. Terry had both hands on the shotgun, although neither of them seemed to be in any rush to do anything. We wait, Shane said. Get back there and stay down. Don't make a sound. What? If they hear you, they'll keep coming until they get in here. We need to play them at their own game, he said. We'd need to play dead. Marla didn't like that plan or non-plan one bit. Driving through them would have been a better option, but that was fraught with dangers. First off, the snow. One slip and they would be out of control, an easy target for the lurkers once the Jeep came to rest. Secondly, there were 8 of them, and they were far enough apart to make hitting them all an impossibility. Sure, 3 or 4 of them would splat, but the ones at the side, the problem ones, would latch onto the snatch by any means necessary. It wasn't an option at all. This is a bad idea, Marla whispered, crawling backwards until she was lying on the floor of the snatch. Jared, petrified, climbed down from the bench and lay next to Marla. What the fuck is out there? He whispered, his voice cracking as if he was about to start sobbing. Trust me, Marla said, putting both hands over the back of her head as if it would conceal her more. It's much better if you don't know. Shit, Jared thought. That was all the answer he needed. 3 of the lurkers had reached the snatch and were trailing bloody hands across the hood. Shane watched with one eye open as the creatures began to rock the Jeep from side to side. Thank fuck the windows are up. Female lurker, probably out cycling when she had been infected, judging by her lycra suit, tried to crawl onto the hood, but her motor functions were long gone and she slipped aside, landing with a thump in the snow beside the snatch. In the back of the Jeep, somebody was whimpering. Shane didn't think it was Marla. The snatch rocked viciously to the left, accompanied by a frustrated grunt from the fat man. When the Jeep fell back into place, Terry sensed an opportunity to move his finger closer to the shotgun trigger. The snow was thicker now than it had been a few minutes earlier. The lurkers were almost camouflaged, so pallid was their skin. Shane had lost visuals on 5 of them, but he knew they were close, and probably trying to figure out what to do next. He could see Fat Man in his peripheral vision, and the cyclist was clambering back to her feet on Terry's side of the Jeep. The 3rd lurker, a nondescript beast apart from the fact he was... But if he could taste them, then he didn't show it. After a few seconds, he lurched around the side of the Jeep and began to scramble towards the horde, who were 20 feet behind the vehicle now and moving away. Shane exhaled with relief, the pistol relaxed in his grip. He watched the horde become smaller in the rearview mirror, but with visibility reduced so severely they had vanished before their groans had ceased. "I don't think I could ever do that again," Terry finally said. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps that suggested how difficult he had found it keeping motionless. "Intense just doesn't cut it." "Is it over?" Marla asks from the floor of the snatch. "I swear to God, Shane, next time you better go straight through them." "It worked, didn't it?" Shane said, checking across his shoulder, glancing into the snow for a sign the creatures weren't going to return. "Who was whining back there?" Terry asked, placing the Remington back between his knees. "Shit like that could get us killed." "I'm sorry," Jared said. "I had no idea how many of them there were. Nobody tells me shit." "For good reason," Marla said. "Anyway, it doesn't matter. We're okay and those fucking things didn't manage to get in. You said this thing has armor?" Shane nodded. "The best," he said. "But if they really wanted to get in, they'd just keep on trying until they succeeded. Thank fuck they were in no mood to hang about." "Can we get out of here now?" Terry said, straightening up in his seat. "I think I'm gonna need a pit stop at the next available junction." That, Shane thought, might be a good idea. He turned the key in the ignition. 11. Victor decided to call a meeting before leaving. It was the done thing. You didn't just up and leave with no notice. You informed the people who placed their trust in you. And that way, they respected you even more. Staring down at the faces in the crowd, though, Victor wasn't so sure. He felt as if he were addressing a bunch of school kids, but all of a sudden he felt exposed, vulnerable, and very naked. "Ladies, gentlemen, can I just say a few words?" He watched as a few of the survivors decided to button it, urging the people standing next to them to let him speak. In the corner of the room, Maggie Cox smoked a cigarette and stared at him with those sunken eyes. Her wizened, macerated face seemed to be taunting him silently. He could only look at her for a second before choosing a different focal point altogether. "People," Victor said, raising both hands calmly, almost apologetically. "I need to speak with you regarding a problem I have been made aware of." That did it. People hushed their neighbors more vehemently, and they listened. "That's better," the captain said. "Now, as most of you know, I have been trying to keep this place going as best as I can, safe, guarded. I have been bringing food in so that we all eat, and I have been trying to obtain medicine for the sick." As if to emphasize just how sick some people were, there came a chorus of coughs. Victor had to wait for a few moments before he could continue. "Now, I think that I have been fair and helpful, and taking care of everything that it has been within my power to do. But a few people, who if you look around you will notice are no longer with us, have decided to strike out on their own, make a run for it, so to speak." A cacophony of shocked gasps filled the room, and Victor Lord knew that he still had his people, or the majority of them. "Now, people, I wouldn't have given two shits had they decided to go in the middle of the night. Everybody has the right to decide their own fate, and that goes for all of you standing before me now. But these people, these assholes, took something that we believe is vital to the well-being of this here group." The survivors were rapt. A few of them yelled towards the front of the room, outraged by the audacity of the deserters. Typically, these were males, 40 to 50, general scumbags who didn't want to have to lift a finger to maintain the camp. and it was beginning to sound like they might have to.
"One of our jeeps has been taken," Victor continued. "These sons of bitches decided to jump up sticks in the middle of the fucking night. Now, I have no idea where they are going, but I can ensure you that we will find them and bring back our truck."
There were a few cheers, but nowhere near as many as Victor had hoped for. Once the dire applause died down, a voice spoke from the back of the room. Victor didn't even need to look to know who it was. "And what are you going to do with the people?" Maggie Cox asked, exhaling a plume of blue-gray smoke into the atmosphere. "You going to be bringing them back, too?" She already knew the answer to that, which is why she had wanted to bring it to the attention of the others.
"Do you think they deserve a second chance?" Victor asked.
God, how he hated that mummified old sow.
"They have taken something that is vital to this group. Their selfish actions could cause deaths, could kill all of us."
Maggie huffed and stubbed her cigarette out on the doorframe to her right.
"You and I both know that this is not the truth," she said, her voice hoarse. "We have more vehicles, and we have that whirly bird up on the roof. You have absolutely no reason to go running after them other than revenge." She lit another cigarette and smiled smugly to herself. The survivors turned back to Victor and awaited his response silently. He laughed, a nervous chuckle that made him look stupid and inept. God, how he fucking hated that rotting bitch. "I assure all of you that revenge is not what I am after. These people have forfeited their rights as far as I am concerned. And I want to make sure that they realize just how much danger they have placed all of you in."
That's right, Victor thought. Lay it on thick. Get the crowd back, vying for blood.
"Do you even know where they have gone?" Maggie called, stepping forward between two dome tents. "They could be anywhere by now. You're talking about going out after them as if you know which direction they're pointed in. Shit, Captain. Just how dumb are you?" "Now you just watch your tongue," Victor said, sensing that the woman was intentionally trying to make him look moronic. "We know they left this morning early, and that snow out there is going to tell us just which fucking direction they've gone in. Their tracks will still be visible from the helicopter." "And you're going to bring them back here when you reach them?" she reiterated.
Victor paused, tried to think of a way around it. A few cheers from the side of the room. Once again, the lumberjack contingency.
"These people are being fed lies," Maggie said, trembling a little now. "You've put the fear of God into them, and now they trust you implicitly, just so you know, Mr. High and Mighty. I will not be part of any schemes you put forward. I don't trust you one bit. And I want everyone here to listen to me." She sucked hard on the cigarette, struggling to keep it steady in her trembling, gnarled hand. "This is wrong. Going after them is wrong. We all know what he's going to do to them when he catches up. It's murder, plain and simple. And whichever way you sugarcoat it, it's fucked up." She glanced around the room to all the faces, young and old, staring in her direction. She could tell that her words were having little or no impact. Without another utterance, she turned and left through the doors, the sound of the mumbling assembly behind her. "Well, that was special," Victor said, victorious. She'd made herself look like a crazy old witch. Perhaps I was being too kind and offensive to witches everywhere. "Now, I don't know how long we're to be gone," he continued, glad to see that the focus had returned to him. "But I assure you all that we will be back with the Jeep and a shitload of supplies and medicine. You have my word." The applause that followed was deafening. Victor Lord was on the verge of actually bowing, as if he had just finished a masterful stage performance on Broadway. He made his way down and out through the doors, survivors patting him on the back as he went. Once out of earshot, he turned to David Moon and said, "Is the pilot ready?" Moon nodded. "Yeah, but he ain't in the best fucking mood about all of this." "I sure wouldn't mind that at all," he said. "Good," Victor grinned. "I'm leaving you in charge for the next few days. I don't think it should be too much of a problem, not with a man of your tenacity." Colburn didn't know what that word meant, but assumed it was something good. "Everything will be just as you left it," he said, "apart from one thing." Victor laughed, knowing that Colburn meant it and would not let him down. It was nice. It would have been a hell of a lot nicer if the undead weren't returning with a taste for human flesh, but you couldn't have everything your own way, could you? She left the house with more layers than she needed. It was better that way. There was always the option to remove a layer, whereas she would be fucked if the temperature plummeted even more. She headed across the field and into the town, knowing that the creatures would probably be around at some point. The difference now was she could see them properly. It was easier evading them or hunting them when the sun was up, and the snow made it even easier, as she would hear their footfall before she would even spot them. She had a problem, though. The house was no longer somewhere she felt safe. She wanted more, something bigger, a place where there was more than just a window and a plank of MDF separating them from her. There seemed to be a lot more of them hovering around the field after dark, and she had no idea why. It was only a matter of time before they began to go to work on the windows and doors. Her sanctuary was no longer invulnerable. Add to that the fact that there was no heating, and the snowfall had made her wonder just how cold it was going to get in the following weeks, and she knew she had to find somewhere new to hold out. Trudging through the snow with just a tiny backpack, she reached the outskirts of town feeling quite refreshed. Apparently, a bean supper washed down with strawberry-flavored water did wonders to the system. She felt like she could run, perhaps for the first time in days. She just hoped that it wouldn't be necessary. After a quick break and a sip of water, normal, tasteless water, she pushed on, following the signs at every junction. The snow was falling heavy once again, and she remembered the Christmases past when things had been normal, or at least a little bit more regular, and the snow had fallen outside the window. She pushed the memories away, though, as she came across a large building. Surrounded by a black wrought iron fence on all sides, it looked to be the kind of place where British royalty might visit. The golden finials sitting atop the gate added to the regal look. She stared down the long, winding driveway, trying to figure out what the place was. She had never seen it before, but then again, she had never ventured out to this side of the town. There was no way in, at least not from where she stood gathering snow. The fence snaked around the building, shutting it off from the world. It was perfect. It was exactly what she had been hoping for. After walking the fence perimeter, she located what appeared to be the main entrance. Whatever this place was, it was intended for visitors. There were small signs just off the driveway. One pointed to the larger door at the front and announced Museum Entrance, while another directed you to the back of the building, where apparently there was a cafeteria and public toilets. Museum. She walked the driveway. Despite the increasing inches of snow, gravel crunched underfoot. She kept a close eye on her surroundings, making sure that there were no creatures following. She could hear a few off in the distance, somewhere behind her, but they were far enough away to be considered no threat. The door was closed, but not locked. She pushed through it and found herself standing in a remarkable foyer. She had seen elephants up close on many occasions, but she had never seen one in skeletal form until now. It was amazing. Standing right there, probably to greet the visitors and announce the amazing things to come,
It looked as if it had been stripped of its flesh and skin where it stood. The door clunked shut behind her, and she found the latch which would offer her a little bit of safety. With the door secure for now, she moved from the foyer and that magnificent beast of bone, and into the first room. The first thing she noticed was the change in temperature. The foyer had been cold, almost as cold as outside, but this room was nice, warm, comfortable. It meant that the heating was still working, which in itself made her instantly ecstatic. Light poured down from the 3 expensive-looking chandeliers. So she had warmth, she had light, and she knew that somewhere in the building there would be food. The sign on the driveway had pointed the way to a cafeteria, but she didn't want to rely on the food there. Sandwiches would be no good, and cakes and fancies were probably just as useless. Maybe there was a freezer, but that was something she would concern herself with at a later time. For now, she knew exactly what she had to survive on. Across the room, pushed up against the wall, sat a vending machine. Even from where she stood, she could name most of the brands of crisps and chocolate. Her face lit up at her discovery. Would it be alarms? She didn't know, but she would figure out how to get at the food later. For now, though, she was content with what she had. It was a damn sight better than the house. She had no reason to return there, not now. The few items which she had left behind were replaceable and unworthy of a trip back in the wrong direction. She began to make herself at home in the museum. 13. Kyle was not happy about the situation, not at all. Being ordered around by an ex-captain was one thing, but being forced into the helicopter with a gun to his head, well, that was just downright rude. "There's no need for that," he said, seating himself in the cockpit. "I said I was pissed off. I didn't say I wouldn't do it." "Hey, I've got an idea," Moon said, tapping the barrel of the Walther against the pilot's head. "How about you shut up and get this fucking thing in the air?" Flyboy swallowed. There was something a little disconcerting about having a pistol held to your head, and it was all new to him. "We'll be in the air in a jiffy," he said, his throat suddenly blocked with bile. A voice came from behind. Flyboy recognized Victor Lord's throaty rasp almost immediately. "Is he giving you shit?" Victor asked. "Nothing I can't handle," Moon replied, climbing into the helicopter. For somebody with a gun to his head, he sure has a lot to say. "No, I don't," Flyboy interjected. "In fact, I was just trying to figure out what gun it was. I'm a huge fan of "Just get this bitch in the air," Victor snapped. "And if you try anything stupid, it'll be the last thing you do." "It'll be the last thing we all do," Flyboy thought. Since he was the only pilot aboard, he was kind of irreplaceable, which gave him the smallest sense of security. Although he could still fly the chopper with broken kneecaps, which was something worth thinking about when it came to opening his big mouth. He took the helicopter up. The 3 men in the back, Victor Lord and his minions, Moon and Randall, were mumbling amongst themselves. Flyboy couldn't hear a damned word they were saying, which he thought was probably a good thing. The less he knew, the better. What he did know, though, was that this was not a rescue mission. Shane had pissed the captain off royally by taking the jeep. The best possible outcome of this little expedition was, well, he didn't want to think about it. Had he any options? He didn't think so. When a man the size of David Moon holds a gun against your head, the best thing to do is comply. Sure, he had given a pointless diatribe in an attempt to stall the inevitable, but that was about as far as he was willing to go. Hopefully his recalcitrance had bought Shane and his group a few extra minutes. For what it was worth. He lowered the chopper down to about 100 feet. There were no power lines in the vicinity, nothing he could snag on at that particular height. They were safe, for now. Beneath them, the tire tracks on the road were still visible, leading north to I-20. He knew where they were headed, but the longer he kept that nugget of information to himself, the better. A group of lurkers, around 12 of them in total, were shambling through the section of forest beneath them. They looked lost, which was probably the case.
"Motherfuckers,"
Moon snapped, before beginning to fire at them with his pistol. Victor grimaced, contorting his face to show how annoying the gunshots were.
"Do you have to?" he sighed. "You're hardly making a difference."
As if in response, one of the creatures collapsed through the trees. Moon punched the air with his fist.
"Oh, well done,"
Victor added with more than a hint of sarcasm.
"You got one. Just 6.5 million left to go."
Moon holstered his weapon and slumped against the helicopter door. The fun had been removed from his little game. As they passed over a playground, a group of infected children were lurching around, bouncing into the swings and roundabouts. Some of them still wore the school uniform that they had been attacked in. Others were naked and blue from the freezing snow. Moon took out his pistol and lined it up with one of the children. He was just about to fire when Victor kicked him hard as hell in the shin.
"It's a fucking kid,"
Victor said admonishingly.
"Would you do that if it was one of your own?"
Moon rubbed at the spot on his shin where Victor's toe had connected.
"Fucking hell, Captain," he said, sucking air through his teeth. "It was just a lurker."
Victor leant forward so that his face was barely an inch away from Moon's.
"You're right," he said. "But you never had kids of your own, did you?" "I did. 3 of them. All grown up now. In fact, probably all dead. You shoot them for no reason, you prick. Then you're just as bad as they are. Lurkers or not, the next bullet you waste had better be on yourself. Understand?"
Moon thought silently for a few seconds before nodding. He hadn't considered the severe lack of ammunition. Victor was right about conserving what he had left.
"Sir, the tracks seem to be fading," Randall said, pointing to the road beneath.
Victor moved through the cabin to get a better look.
When he saw that Randall was right, he said, "I don't think we're going to have too much of a problem finding them. We know which direction they're traveling. And it's not as if there's going to be any other moving vehicles on the road." He returned to his seat. "No, I really don't think the snow is going to be an issue." Although thinking about it, he wasn't so sure. 14. As far as rest stops went, this one was the lowest of the low. It was basically a brick block in the middle of nowhere. Shane was undecided whether it had been intended as a toilet, or whether it had just turned out to be one because, well, it was so unsightly and godforsaken that it couldn't be utilized as anything else. They decided to go in shifts. It seemed like the best way to work it. If something should happen, if a horde should appear from nowhere, which was something that had started to happen a lot lately, then the person in the driver's seat could sound the horn or move to safety. As ideas went, it was the best they could come up with. Marla went first. Not only was she bursting for a piss, but she had a few feminine issues which needed taking care of, although she didn't deem this information worthy for broadcast to the rest of the group. The inside of the toilet block made the outside look like the White House. There were shards of porcelain scattered across the ground, the aftermath of one of the toilets getting a kicking, and an inch of dirty water coated the ground, complete with floating cigarette butts and tampons. Marla sloshed through the room and barricaded herself into cubicle 3. After wiping the seat several times with toilet roll, which she was surprised to find even existed in such a cesspit, she pulled her jeans down halfway and sat. The relief that came was unsurprisingly welcome, and she sighed and closed her eyes. A smile curled the corner of her mouth. The water began to soak through her boots. She could feel the cold creeping along her toes and shuddered at the thought. What she would have given for a shower, a nice hot soapy scrub with coconut conditioner. She imagined the water warm and creamy, coating her body, dripping down and leaving a trail of warmth behind it.
It was heaven. At least it would have been if she wasn't sat on a dirty toilet in the middle of nowhere with ice water sending chills through her entire body. She opened her eyes and tried to forget the fact that a hot shower was currently as likely as a lasting relationship. The apocalypse had ruined quite a lot of people's days. She finished up and reached across for the toilet roll. It was then that she saw it, and her heart jumped up into her throat. Staring at her through a tiny hole in the cubicle wall was a bloodshot eye. She almost fell off the toilet and into the freezing water beneath. The eye vanished, but that was not the end of it. The possessor of the eye appeared on the floor. She was trying to push herself through the space between the cubicle and the floor. It splashed around, growling and snapping at Marla's feet. The black ooze that fell out of its mouth dripped into the water and diluted into a murky gray. Marla screamed, hoping that they would hear her in the snatch. She slipped off the seat and pushed herself as far away from the hellish creature as possible. It was difficult to maneuver with her jeans halfway down around her knees, and she found herself on the floor of the cubicle whimpering, kicking in a frenzy at the lurker opposite. The creature had obviously been there the whole time. If it had crept in after Marla, the guys in the jeep would have sounded the horn. How long was it waiting? Just sitting and hiding, hoping for its food to come to her. Marla snapped out her left leg, kicking the creature in the face so hard that its nose ruptured, spraying black goo in all directions. The nasal bone was jutting out of the creature's face now, and the visible cartilage made Marla want to upchuck right there. It grabbed onto Marla's kicking leg and dragged itself forward another couple of inches. Marla cried out, hoping, please God, fucking help, that her rescuers would appear just in time, like they always did in the movies. The lurker was at the halfway point. Its upper torso was all the way through, grasping onto Marla's flailing legs, trying to pull them towards its snapping mouth. Fucking bitch, Marla screamed, driving a knee into the creature's face. The nose, which had already shattered, completely detached, leaving only a gaping hole where it had been. Thick black sludge pumped from the hole. The creature didn't notice, or care for that matter, and swung its arm over Marla's leg. It managed to latch onto her jeans, which were still hanging around her ass, and pulled her closer. Marla knew that if she didn't do something, and fast, she would be infected. All it took was a scratch or a single bite, and it was bye-bye old Marla. Hello, cannibal girl. She punched out with both fists and managed to knock the lurker's head to the side, where it couldn't snap at her bare flesh. It gave her enough time to grab for the only available weapon. She pushed with her feet, actually using the lurker's face to get to where she needed to be. Reaching across, she lifted the cistern lid from the back of the toilet. It felt good in her hands, heavy, dangerous. Slipping in the water, lapping around her ankles, she landed back down on the cubicle floor with a painful thud. Her tailbone would be sore later on, if there was a later on. The creature screeched. Its face twisted into something more horrific than before. Lashing out with its clawed hand, it realized that the opportunity to infect the human or feed from it was fast fading. With one final almighty lunge, it propelled itself forward. Its entire body was in the cubicle now with Marla, who was wondering just how hard it could be to take a piss in peace. Marla lifted the porcelain weight high above her head and screamed, louder than the lurker, louder even than she had anticipated. She brought it down, caving the creature's skull in with the first impact. One eye fell from its socket and was now floating atop the murky ice water. Marla lifted the cistern lid once more. She slammed it down, this time in silence. The meaty squelch, which came as the block made contact, though, shattered the silence. The creature slumped forward, face down in the gray water where it lay motionless, the back of its head exposed, brain matter spilling out in a river of viscous slush. Marla tried to breathe. Tears were stinging her eyes as she dropped the cistern lid down onto the back of the creature's head. She sat for a moment, gathering thoughts and trying to fathom what had just happened. Standing, she pulled her jeans up. Wiping seemed pointless now, and would have simply been a force of habit rather than a necessity. She pushed the cubicle door so hard that it slammed on the next one and snapped off its hinges. When she got outside and the cold hit her full force, she fought back the tears that threatened to betray her. The Jeep was parked where it had been. Shane was hanging half out the window, smiling ever so slightly. Marla could have punched him right then. Just walked around to his face and smashed his nose in, the way she had smashed the lurkers. "Better?" Shane asked, stepping out of the Jeep. When he noticed that she was soaked from chest to toe, a puzzled expression appeared on his face. Marla shook her head. "You might want to check the cubicles before you piss," she said, the tears even closer now. "Plus, I don't know about the men's, but the women's was a bit flooded." Without another word, she clambered into the back of the snatch. No tears. Not this time. 15. She liked the dinosaur room the best. There was something magical about being surrounded by creatures that had been extinct for millions of years. Some of the dinosaurs were intended to move, but the power had been cut or had failed somehow, which meant that they just stood instead in magnificent glory. She felt alive for the first time in weeks. Whether it was the fact she was safe for now, or had enough food to survive on without putting herself at further risk, she didn't know. What she did know, however, was that the Giganotosaurus existed 90 million years ago, in the late Cretaceous period, and that little morsel of knowledge made her happy. She had managed to get into the vending machine with nothing more than a crowbar and some brute force. The first chocolate bar tasted good, the second even better, but it was nice to pretend, at least for now. She searched the next room, which was something to do with Romans. There were tunics and togas encased in glass. Some of them were in better condition than others, but it had been a violent time to live, and the slashes across some of the clothes were only to be expected. Further along, hanging on the wall, were various warrior clothes. She recognized the breastplate, the tunics, the belt and arm guards. If they were genuine, they were in very good condition. Perhaps the enemy was too busy chopping up the villagers to attack the soldiers, if the encased togas were anything to go by. She found a book on the Romans and carried it with her back into the dinosaur room. She curled up in the corner, wearing a genuine American Indian powwow shawl she found hanging up 3 rooms away, and began to read. She was asleep before the end of page 2. "Will they kill them?" Kelly Bloom asked her mother. "I don't want them to die." Susie almost choked on her water. It spurted out of her nose like a watery sneeze. "Kelly, nobody's going to kill anybody," she said, wiping the liquid away from her mouth. "They're just going after them to make sure they don't do anything stupid." Kelly wasn't stupid either. And without pausing for thought, she said, "But that old lady said they were going to kill them. Why would she say that if it weren't true?" Damned Maggie Cox. Susie had a good mind to give her a round of fucks, not that it would do any good. "She was just speculating, honey," Susie said, stroking her daughter's hair, which was matted, greasy, and starting to smell a bit strange. It was almost wash day. Susie would make certain that Kelly's hair had a thorough scrub. "I was telling the truth," a voice said. Both Susie and her daughter turned to find Maggie Cox standing not 3 feet away. "Problem is that nobody around here wants to listen to a little old fart like me." "Do you mind?" Susie said. "I don't like that kind of language around my daughter." "Oh, I'm sure she doesn't mind," the elderly woman continued, smiling, a mouthful of discolored teeth on display. She took a step closer and sat cross-legged next to Kelly. "You don't mind if a silly old fart like me says naughty words?" "Mommy says it's rude to swear," Kelly said, not sure whether she was allowed to talk to Maggie Cox or not. She looked nervously to her mother. "That's right, Kelly," Susie said, with more pride than she could ever explain in words. To Maggie, she said, "I've brought her up to respect people, even when they don't really deserve it." "Well," Maggie said, grinning, "that's your mistake, ain't it?" She turned back to Kelly and said, "It was true, though. What I said to the nasty man was true." Susie wasn't going to stand for this. Her daughter was impressionable, far too impressionable for her years. The old lady seemed nice enough, or she had before everything had erupted earlier that day, Nice, though, did not give her the right to spout nonsense and fill her daughter's head with fallacies and fables. I would appreciate it if you kept your little conspiracies to yourself, Susie said, trying not to sound too rude, but it was more difficult than she had imagined. Maggie, ignoring Susie with everything that she had, said, "You want to know the truth, don't you? There's no point being lied to by adults just because you're a little girl, is there?" Kelly shook her head. "Mommy says that lying is a bad thing." Susie could feel her blood boiling. She reached across and placed a hand on Kelly's shoulder and was about to remove her from the situation when a voice interrupted her. Across the room, one of the soldiers, she didn't know his name, called out for Maggie. A look of fear and confusion spread across the old woman's face, a look that wasn't entirely certain. "If I'm not back in half an hour," Maggie said, clambering to her feet, her back audibly doors. As she went, she tightened the lilac scarf that hung loosely around her neck. "Are they going to hurt her?" Kelly asked. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that Susie almost choked on her own saliva. "Of course not," Susie said, stroking the side of her daughter's face with the back of her hand. "The lady probably just needs to take some medicine or something." She knew that to be a lie, but couldn't for the life of her think of anything else to say. Kelly shook her head and stared towards the ground sheet on which she sat. "I have a really bad feeling, Mommy," she said. "I think I want to go to sleep for a while." Susie smiled, forcibly scrunching her face into something approaching comfort. "I think that would be a good idea," she said. "I'll wake you when it's time to eat." Kelly was sleeping in less than 4 minutes. Her mother sat stroking her hair, pondering just what had gone wrong with the world. 16. Snow remained the same. Shane doubted it would. The skies looked full of it, off-white blankets that seemed to go on forever. In the passenger seat, Terry silently read his Bible. Shane could hear snoring from the back, a deep rumble of guttural snorts, which he didn't think Marla was capable of. Jared, on the other hand. "How are we for fuel?" Terry asked without looking up from his book. Shane looked to the gauge, which still sat quite nicely between the quarter and half mark. "Why are you so worried about the fuel?" he asked. "I said I'd let you know as soon as we needed to stop." Now Terry did look up, but glanced out of his window. "As soon as we hit the interstate," he said, "we ain't gonna be able to stop for a while. I'm just making sure we've got enough to get us to where we need to be. The last thing we want to do is break down in the middle of nowhere, especially when the chance of lurkers is severely increased." Shane slowly drifted past a snow-covered cadaver. He could see it was, or had been, female, but was now nothing more than a freezing mound of half-eaten flesh. "You're right," Shane said. "Probably best if we fill up at the next station." He didn't want to. Fuck, why would he? Stopping for anything was dangerous. He hadn't questioned Marla, but he knew that something had happened back at the last stop. Maybe she would tell them later, or maybe she would keep it to herself the way women had a strange knack of doing. "I think that would be for the best," Terry said. "You never know, so don't take any fucking chances." "Same goes for you," Terry replied. "You see anything creeping up on me, make it count." Shane nodded. He pulled the Jeep onto the forecourt and hoped to God the refueling went without a hitch. "I take it we're staying put," Marla's voice said, although she didn't sound too annoyed at the prospect. "There's no point all of us getting out," Shane said as he switched the engine off and opened his door. "I've got Terry's back, which was one more than I'm comfortable with." Terry was already making his way across the court. He was equidistant to the pumps and the station. Shane was about to call out when he noticed the eerie silence about the place and decided against it. Besides, there was nothing creeping up on Terry, nothing on the other side of the windows either, although Terry would probably see more once he reached the place. Shane was pleased to put his feet on dry ground as he dropped down out of the Jeep. The concrete cover of the gas station was more comforting than he could have hoped for. Not even one flake of snow landed on him as he reached for the pump.
Then he found himself wondering whether the fucking snatch took unleaded or diesel. He had been stupid not to check before taking it, and now he found himself standing at a fuel pump with a metaphorical impotent cock in his hand. Momentary panic washed over him. He knew the consequences of making the wrong decision. It was a 50-50 decision that he didn't want to have to make. Terry was already at the door of the station. As he entered, pulling up and stealing fuel, yet on this occasion it was nothing but a fucking nuisance. Something had gone down in the station, but Terry doubted that the blame lay with looters. Everything still appeared to be there. There was just more of it on the floor than on the shelves where it belonged. A bloody smudge decorated the fridge to the left of him. A clear handprint dragged downwards towards the ground. Where was the body? Terry could hear the sound of his own heartbeat as it hush-thumped inside his head. He dry swallowed and gingerly stepped up to the counter. Peering over, he saw the rigor mortis arm of the female cashier who had, unfortunately, picked the wrong night shift. She was fresh, perhaps 12 hours, which meant that there were lurkers in the area. Stepping around to the body, which was missing most of its head and a lot of its torso, Terry began to search for the switches that activated the pumps. The only problem was that he had never paid much attention to gas station attendants while they did it. Either that or he was out by the car, waving frantically to get their attention. There were lots of buttons, including a big red one which probably alerted the local PD in the event of a robbery. Out here it would take them at least an hour to send a unit, and by then it would almost certainly be too late. Maybe the oversized button was merely to make the attendant feel more comfortable, sort of an electronic placebo. Terry glanced out through the window and saw Shane looking as confused as he was. The guy was searching for something beneath the hood of the snatch, and for a moment Terry found himself panicking. Is there a problem? Is it fucking overheating? And then he clicked. Shane was nonplussed over which type of fuel to use. Terry managed to locate the set of buttons required and clicked the one for pump 8. There was a deep thrum as the pump kicked into action. Shane almost banged his head on the open hood. Terry tapped gently on the window in a vain attempt to get Shane's attention. It worked. Making a D for diesel with both hands, Terry smiled, then made the universal signal of the dickhead at Shane, who began to smile. With the snatch being filled, Terry decided to grab a few things. Since the barracks was severely depleted of it, he shoved handfuls of pills and medicine into his jacket. By the time he was finished, his pockets bulged, filled to capacity. They would be grateful back at the barracks, though. It was too late for a few, but those that remained needed all the help they could get. He stepped slowly over the stiff cadaver, who apparently was called Julie when she had been in better shape, and moved for the fridge. Ignoring the bloody handprint, he swung the door open and was delighted to find several cans of Red Bull hidden behind the milk. He cracked one open and downed it in a few gulps. With the rush of sugar and caffeine, he felt like he had been reborn. The accumulation of several days' fatigue vanished in an instant. It truly was the drink of the gods. He grabbed 2 more cans and turned for the door. It was then that a cold, dead hand grasped him hard around the throat. They came out of nowhere silently, which made Shane wonder if they were evolving somehow. He was almost finished pumping gas when Marla screamed from the back of the snatch. He dropped the pump as her screech echoed through the forecourt. As he turned, he saw 3 of them, pushed up against the station, trying to get into Terry. "Where the fuck did they come from?" Shane yelled, unintentionally drawing the 3 lurkers' attention. Terry, through the station window, was struggling with a single lurker. It had him around the throat, but Shane knew that it was no match for the old man, who was already lifting the shotgun into place beneath the growling creature's chin. Bang! Blood flew from the top of its skull, spraying the ceiling with a thick black goo. Terry was fine, already on his way out of the station to help with the other 3. Shane ignored Marla's screams, though it might have been Jared, it was difficult to tell, and placed himself in front of the jeep. He put the first creature down with 1 shot to the head. The second, a bearded, vagrant-looking motherfucker, scampered forward at a speed that seemed beyond it. Shane leveled the pistol and fired, but only managed to graze its cheek. A hole appeared in the front of the creature's face. Its tongue was the only determinable feature remaining, as the rest of its face exploded outwards in a violent eruption. As the lurker fell forward, Shane caught a glimpse of Terry as he reloaded the shotgun. The old man had saved him, or at least that was how he would see it. As the third creature rounded the side of the Jeep, Shane knew he had to act quickly. There were people in there, scared people who would probably not want to find themselves face to face with one of the undead peering through the back. He lifted the Walther and fired. An explosion of blood and gore. Well, that's what should have happened. Instead, the gun simply clicked. Shane couldn't believe how stupid he had been. He should have checked the gun for rounds before packing it, and now, because he hadn't, it was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Without pause, he raced around to meet the creature at the back of the snatch. It grunted, lunged for him, sprayed the front of his jacket with dark, infected saliva. The pistol slammed against the lurker's temple. Shane was glad to see teeth flying out of the side of its mouth. Inside the Jeep, Marla was scrambling to her feet. She picked up a tire iron that she had been keeping a close eye on for the duration of the journey, though she didn't think she would need to use it. Shane hit the creature again. Its head snapped to the side. There was a crunch as its neck broke. Its head dangled loosely now on a pivot. "Shane, let me take it," Terry called as he made his way around to the rear of the vehicle. Shane was preventing him from getting a clean shot. "I've got it," Shane said. He tucked the pistol into the front of his trousers and grabbed the lurker's broken face with both hands. He heard Terry mutter something from behind, but ignored it. The creature grimaced as if it knew what was about to happen. Shane put a knee into the thing's belly and pulled. For a moment he didn't think anything was going to happen, and then it did. The lurker gargled as its head came away from the rest of it. The body fell backwards, hitting the concrete with a meaty thump. Shane growled maniacally as he realized he was holding the lurker's head. Marla, staring out the back of the snatch, turned the other way, not wanting to see any more. "Holy shit," Terry said, allowing the shotgun to drop to his side. "That is just all kinds of wrong." Shane tossed the head aside and wiped his soiled hands on the front of his coat. Terry stepped up to Shane, who was shaking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "It's okay, Shane," he said, although he wasn't sure if it actually was. "Can we just get the fuck out of here now?" Shane turned. His eyes were wide, like saucers, and his breathing was so heavy that Terry could feel the warmth on his face even though he was a foot away. "We need to go," Shane finally said. "That's what I just said," Terry replied. "No," Shane said, pointing towards the station. "We need to go right now." They were coming from everywhere. Lurkers, about 30 of them, all scrambling forward through the snow. They must have been feeding on something at the rear of the building. There was a car wash just out of sight, and they must have been otherwise occupied. Until now. Terry ran around the snatch and practically fell in through the door. Shane was already trying to start the engine, though his hands were so cold that he fumbled with the key for what seemed like an eternity, before managing to get it into the ignition. Could we go now?" Jared gasped from the back. He could see out through the mesh. In fact, he had the best view in the house. Shane turned the key and half expected the Jeep to fail to start, like it always did in the movies. When it kicked into life first time, he felt as if something was on their side, something preternatural watching over them. "Drive," Terry said, winding his window down halfway. Cold instantly filled the snatch. For a moment, Shane had no idea what Terry was doing. Then the old man leveled the shotgun out of the window, aiming towards the ground, and the pump which Shane had been using. The fuel was still pouring out. "Uh-oh," Shane said as he pulled the Jeep away from the station. The creature stumbled forward a few feet, confused, desperate to latch onto the vehicle and the people inside of it. Terry waited, and waited, and then fired. The Jeep seemed to speed up as the blast kicked the back of it. Marla screeched, as did Jared. Shane was too busy trying to keep the snatch on the road to make any sort of noise. He could see in the rearview mirror, though, a bright orange ball of flame whipping up to the station roof. It was as if a mini nuke had been detonated. Lurkers were running everywhere, most of them on fire.
Some of them had come apart with the first blast, and limbs began to rain down on the road like a storm in hell. A leg bounced off the Snatch's hood, and Shane had to swerve to prevent the Jeep from hitting a hedgerow. When they were a few 100 meters away, there was another explosion, this one bigger than the first, and then the only sound came from the engine, and collective sighs. "I'm thinking you need to work on that anger of yours," Shane said to Terry, whose eyes were closed. "That's a bit rich coming from you." Terry smiled. He opened one eye before adding, "Pistol whipper." After that, nobody spoke for a while. 17. Colburn led the old woman to a secluded away from the rest of us. He can't really like us too much. Colburn opened his mouth as he realized what the old bitch was getting at. Well, he likes to make sure that he's tip-top, so he can keep this place running smoothly. Wouldn't want him to catch any of those poor people's colds. No, Colburn replied, irritated. We wouldn't. He led her up a set of stairs, and to be quite frank, even he didn't have a clue what was at the end of them. He just hoped she didn't catch on before he had a chance to do it. Why do you do what he tells you to? The woman asked. There's no law, not anymore, and there sure as fuck ain't no military. Colburn bit his lip. It was all he could do not to just turn around and boot her down the steps. Ma'am, I do what he tells me to, because someday this shit is gonna come to an end. When it does, I want to be first up for a promotion. The woman laughed. She didn't realize how close she came to a size 12 in the fucking forehead. You think you'll be remembered for your honor after all this blows over? You're even dumber than you look. Breathe, Henry. Breathe. They reached the top of the stairs, and Colburn took a right. It seemed to be the best choice, since he had no idea if the door to the left was even locked. It would have surely given the game away if he had tried to... Colburn couldn't look at her choking face. He closed his eyes, and wished she would stop making such god-awful noises. Her cold, bony hands were trying to pry his away from her neck, but she was old, and had hardly any strength. Any moment now she would go limp, and that would be it. He squeezed with everything he had, hoping that she fell still, because he didn't think he could take much more of it, and then he was staggering backwards with no idea what was happening. Everything was a blur. I told you, Mommy, I knew the man was going to hurt her. Yes, you did, Susie said, trying to help Maggie Cox to her feet. And I apologize for not listening. Kelly smiled smugly. It was the first time ever that her mother had said sorry for anything, and she had been wrong on so many occasions. Is she okay? Kelly asked, clutching Jezebel to her chest. If she dies, Mommy, I think I might cry. Despite the old lady's gaunt appearance, she was heavy. Perhaps it was the fact that there were bones poking out just beneath the surface of her skin, and Susie didn't really want to hurt her any more than she already had been. She managed to pull Maggie across the corridor and leant her up against the wall. She was conscious, but struggled to breathe properly. Fuck knows what would have happened if they had been a few seconds late. Well, Susie knew that the woman would be dead without a doubt, which is why she had followed so closely, although not too close. There was no point putting her life and the life of her daughter at risk, too. The bad man tried to choke her to death, Kelly said, taking a step towards the prone body of Henry Colburn. Come away from him, Susie cried. The bad man is only having a little sleep. I don't want you anywhere near him when he wakes up. Kelly grinned. He's not sleeping, Mommy. You smashed him in the head with a fire extinguisher. You knocked him out good and proper. Well, Susie said, rubbing the side of Maggie Cox's face to try to calm her down. Or murder me. Just take it easy, Susie said, beckoning Kelly just a little closer, a little farther away from the unconscious, psychotic soldier on the floor. Everything's going to be okay.
Do you really believe that? Maggie Cox said, rubbing at the redness around her throat. Susie Bloom, for once in her life, didn't have an answer. She ate biscuits for dinner, washed down with some form of appleade. It was, possibly, the best meal she had ever had. At least it felt like it. After about an hour of touring the museum, it was amazing. She never knew history could be so enchanting. She made her way back to the dinosaur room, the place where she had left her backpack. Her machete, though, that went with her everywhere. She was safe for now, but that didn't make her stupid. If there was one thing she had learned since the outbreak, it was that lackadaisical was simply another word for lunch. The wind howled outside, which unnerved her a little. At first she thought it was the creatures. They had a tendency to call to each other in a strange moaning vernacular. Once the hackles disappeared from the nape of her neck, she gave herself a stern talking to. It felt good to speak. She had almost forgotten the sound of her own voice, and as the first words escaped her lips, she thought the voice belonged to somebody else, somebody much older. The dinosaur room was warm and lit only by a chandelier that could be altered via a dimmer switch on the east wall. She purposely kept it low. There was very little sense in advertising her presence to all and sundry. She was far enough from the main road not to draw any unwanted attention, but again, that didn't warrant complacency on her part. With her stomach still full from the combination of chocolate biscuits and fizzy soda, she settled down with a pamphlet that she had procured. As she delved into the history behind the Black Death, she couldn't help but feel that something was about to happen. Something abhorrently bad. If she'd known then, as she sat with a tattered manual in her lap and an aching tummy, just how terrible, she would have moved a lot quicker. As it was, she had very little time to do anything about the impending horrors. The wind kicked up a notch outside. For a moment the windows clattered so violently in their frames that she thought they were going to implode, showering down shards of glass and letting all of that terrible snow into her warm domain. Howling wind was one thing, but she was certain that there was something moaning alongside it. And she was right, as a few seconds later she heard it again, a deep, guttural groan that could only mean one thing. She launched to her feet. Half-digested biscuit threatened to fill her throat, but she managed to keep it down. Panicking, she reached around to her back, to where the machete was strapped. She released it and began to swing it through the air, whoosh, whoosh, like a pro baseball player, awaiting the ball that would either be a home run or strike three. The moan came again, and it was close. In the corridor, perhaps, just outside the door. She knew she was fucked. Glancing around the room, her eyes darting each and every way, she tried to find somewhere to hide. If there was one of them, she would have been able to take it. Of that she was certain. The trouble was they didn't travel alone. If there was one, there was bound to be another, maybe a whole horde of them. The chances of her making it out of the dinosaur room alive would be next to nothing if the numbers were too high. It was something she didn't dare think about. She raced across the room, almost tripping over a faux saber-toothed tiger rug. The creature moaned again, and this time something replied. A female, another creature, which already depleted her chances of survival. There was a door, one of those that you need to push a long silver bar in order to get through. Printed on it in red lettering were the words, "Staff only, keep out." In a way, she was the only staff left in the place. She had maintained it for long enough to consider herself a fully fledged employee. She pushed the bar and slipped into the darkness. It was a store cupboard, or something of that ilk. She felt long sticks behind her, poking at her like skeletal fingers. These, of course, were mops and brooms and other cleaning implements that she had no knowledge of. She kicked something and heard the sound of water sloshing around. Whoever had mopped last had forgotten to empty the old water out of the bucket. I might have to drink that, she thought, and then banished it from her mind as it didn't bear thinking about. As she pulled the door shut, click, she heard the main door to the dinosaur room fling open, followed by the hellish conversation of at least two creatures. She closed her eyes,
tried to put herself somewhere else, anywhere else. But it was difficult to drift into her happy place with those things only a few feet away, destroying the little bit of happiness that she had recently found in the museum. Was this really happening? She wasn't sure. It felt like a dream. Like one of those really bad nightmares she had suffered a few months before the virus took everybody that she cared about. But it was real. Of course it was. Life, reality, was one big nightmare now. There was nothing distinguishable between bad dreams and waking hours, not anymore. She dry swallowed, felt the soda bubble up in her stomach, and hoped that she had the strength to keep it down. What made everything worse was the fact she couldn't see them. The door was solid with not even a keyhole. She could hear them just fine. Oh boy, could she hear them. But the not knowing where they were put her somewhere between terrified and out-and-out disturbed. The female one, she assumed, since she hadn't seen it, cried out before there was an almighty crash. She hoped that the creature had somehow severed its own head, perhaps accidentally impaled itself on one of the wooden spears mounted on the west wall. Then she heard it moan again, a false alarm with no good news to follow. How absolutely typical. She lowered herself into the corner, mindful of the mop bucket at her feet, and prayed that they couldn't smell her through the thick wooden door. Maybe they'll go away, she thought, and then added wishful thinking as an aside. They wouldn't just go away. They never did. She suddenly felt more alone than ever before. 18. I think there's something up ahead, Kyle said, dropping the chopper down 100 feet. If the snow worsened in the next half hour, he would have to say something to the prick in the back. It was something that he didn't look forward to with relish. Victor Lord appeared in the cockpit, or at least his face did. What the hell is that? Well, Kyle said, hoping that sarcasm was not going to be the main reason. Of snow, fog, and smoke. They're still fucking alive down there. He was right. Lurkers were wandering around, despite the flames licking around their bodies. There were bodies scattered haphazardly across the snow, smoking, burning, the carcasses of the creatures whose brains had finally succumbed to the fire engulfing the hosts. It looks like our jeep went that way, Victor said, pointing down to the track in the snow, and left one fuck of a mess in its wake. Kyle felt something like pride in that moment. Pure, unadulterated admiration for the group who had caused such wonderful carnage. Do you think we can catch them up? Victor asked, although it wasn't so much a question as a disguised order. I think that we will, eventually, Kyle said, knowing that he would do everything in his power to drag the whirlybird's ass as slowly as possible towards their target. We don't know how long ago this happened. All we do know is that they're heading for Jackson. One way or the other, we'll get to them. He spoke the words, but knew that they were pointless. He would make sure that Shane and the others were unharmed, even if that meant bringing the bird down. Just keep on going, Victor said. I want that fucking jeep before sundown. Captain, I need to speak with you about this weather, Kyle said, hoping to buy a few more moments. You do know that if it continues like this for much longer, we're gonna have to set her down. It's too dangerous, and I ain't one for heroics. We keep going, Victor said, chomping down on his unlit cigar. Until I say when. You're in charge, Kyle said, returning to the previous altitude. But don't say I didn't tell you so when she decides to shut down in midair. The nerves in the cockpit were palpable, although Victor didn't speak for almost another minute. Either he was in deep thought, or he hadn't heard correctly. Keep going, Victor finally said. Is anybody else hungry? Marla asked. Her stomach rumbled even as she spoke. I was too busy thinking about weapons to consider food. There are some snacks in my pack, Terry said, jabbing a thumb in the air. You can have anything you like, just don't touch the barbecue Pringles. Marla tutted and reached for the pack. Where the hell did you get Pringles from?
A few weeks ago when I went out with that soldier Moon. I wish I got more of them now." She unzipped the pack and fumbled around inside. Amongst other things, she found a packet of lifesavers, a box of milk duds, and several packets of mints. She wondered whether these had been considered essentials, or whether Terry had simply grabbed what he could while he had the chance. It didn't matter. Her stomach was cartwheeling inside her. She was just grateful that at least one of them had the foresight to pack a few things. She opened a Reese's Nutrageous bar and bit into it. Taking most of it with her first bite, it tasted good, and it gave her a head rush as she swallowed that she hadn't anticipated. She offered Jared the other half, but he declined silently. She shrugged. "Suit yourself." The other half tasted just as good as the first, and she smacked her lips in what could only be described as an uncouth manner. She stared out the back of the Jeep as the snow-blanketed land passed beneath them. There was something comforting about the snow, and yet she shivered as she watched it drift to the ground. It was never ending, and there was no sign of it relenting. She became hypnotized by the tire tracks they left on the road, and found herself drifting off towards sleep, although not quite. It would have been nice to sleep, perchance to dream. She wasn't sure how many hours remained of daylight. Whatever, it wouldn't be enough. After dark, those things seemed to become more prevalent. They were far from nocturnal, but the darkness seemed to offer them some sort of sanctuary, as if they felt safer after sundown. The last thing she wanted was to be stuck out in the middle of nowhere once the night arrived. What if the snow continued to fall this thickly? What if they beached or skidded off the road? They would be left at the mercy of the night, and that thought was the kind of thing that prevented her from closing her eyes. Jared was humming something melancholic. He was surprisingly quite tuneful. Sure, he was never going to win one of those TV talent shows, but then again, nobody else was either, not anymore. Apart from Jared's haunting rendition of something she didn't recognize, everything was silent. It was nice, peaceful, and she felt every muscle in her body relax as if she had been put in a trance, and then everything went wrong. Up front there were shouts, Terry screaming something. It all happened so fast. She turned to find Jared bug-eyed, trying to figure out what was happening, what was about to happen. They felt the Jeep slip to the side, and then the other, and then Marla watched out the back as the sky became ground, and then sky, and then ground. They were like rag dolls being tossed around inside a spin dryer, metal being torn apart, which was nowhere near as comforting as Jared's soulful humming just a few seconds ago, and then an almighty thunk. The right-hand side of the snatch shrunk to about half its original size. Jagged metal and broken glass filled the space where there had been nothing but a moment before. She hit the side, then the roof, then Jared, who was crying something incomprehensible. And that was about all she remembered. "End of the show, good night, and thank you for coming. Don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out." When the spin cycle came to an abrupt end, she was already standing alone in the darkness, surrounded by nothingness, wondering what the fuck had just happened. Pulling, tugging, her legs and then her ass, hands everywhere, trying to get at her, trying to... lurkers. She kicked out high and wide, although something cried out as she made contact with a shoulder or a cheek. She screeched, but the pain in her head was too much to bear. The hands grabbed at her, at least 4 of them, pulling her, trying to drag her forward any second now, she thought, and there would be pain as teeth sunk into her flesh. And then it would be too late. End of the road for this poor cow. She kicked once more, the pain in her leg, which she would later discover to be just a mild sprain, nothing more, was not going to prevent her from doing everything in her power to stay on the right side of death. She couldn't see properly, but she knew she was still in the snatch, or most of her was. Blood filled her eyes, and sweat, and probably tears. She was burning up, despite the fact that it must have been below freezing, and then some, outside the vehicle. The hands held her feet down, trying to keep her from kicking out, and then a voice said, "Marla, it's okay, Marla. Please,
She recognized it. The dulcet tones of a man who she trusted. It was Shane's voice, which meant that it was Shane's hands trying to restrain her, which meant that it had been Shane's shoulder, arm, head that she had connected with when she had kicked out. She blinked the blood away from her eyes and began to breathe. It hurt. Fuck, did it hurt. She didn't know how badly injured she was, not then, but the pain made it quite obvious that her insides were not where they used to be. Probably smeared all over the Jeep like strange theatrical decor, the kind you were apt to see in a French cinema. "Everything's going to be okay," Terry's voice calmly informed her. "You just need to breathe." Well, thanks for that useful nugget of gin, she thought. I almost forgot about that little-known survival technique known as breathing. "Can you move?" Shane asked. "If you can move, I want you to try to wriggle forward." I think I can," Marla replied, and was surprised that she actually could. Plus, Shane wouldn't have been asking her to try moving if her innards were scattered all over the Jeep, so that was a bonus, too.